Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the members of the public who have joined us today. I would like to acknowledge that we are holding this meeting on the traditional territory of Coast Salish First Nations. I would like to call our special board meeting to order, and just before we start, I'd like to invite Mr. Kieber forward to introduce our new director, or is it manager or director?
It's manager.
Manager of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Natalie Wayner. Natalie's our new finance manager, so she's taking over for Sharon Moss. Natalie's in her second week. She comes to us from the Fraser-Fort George Regional District. And prior to that, she was in the municipality of Campbell River. So she's seen both sides. So yeah, we're glad to have Natalie here. So I'd like to...
Welcome aboard. So, second week, do you know everything now?
Oh, I'm not going to answer that one. Just want to say thanks. My daughter and I have moved here. It's been a really warm response, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kieber. Okay, we have public input period where we offer, approval of the agenda. Thank you, Mr. Barry. Moved by Director Morrison, seconded by Director Jackson. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Public input, up to 3 minutes for anybody who would like to make a comment on something on the agenda.
Good morning, CVRD directors. I know it's early for all of you, and you've had a long day on Wednesday. And I also had a long day on Wednesday waiting to hear some results. I would like to speak to you this morning about regional recreation. Would be a loss of the unique identities that have been created in the CVRD areas, mostly the rural, semi-rural electoral areas. CVRD areas have a sense of pride in their unique recreation opportunities they provide at their facilities for the residents in their areas and for outlying areas. Opening a recreation brochure from your area means you are not having to spend time looking through pages of information on areas that are a long distance away. Talking to people who work at your local facilities makes you feel like you matter and creates a hometown feeling, not just a number. People have chosen to live in the Cowichan Valley because we are a unique area and have recreation opportunities that do not require them to seek indoor activities. Many spend time outdoors due to the mild climate of our area, as is reflected in the user numbers. As the Recreation Selection Committee has been unable to come to a consensus, this is a clear indication that now is not the time for regional recreation. As good neighbors, the electoral areas, Duncan, North Cowichan, Lake Cowichan, and Town of Ladysmith should be able to collaborate on funding as grants to facilities that are used by each jurisdiction. Rushing to meet the 20th of October election deadline for a referendum when there has been no consensus by the Recreation Selection Committee that was selected by the CVRD appears to be more about rushing ahead to save money on a referendum than coming to a consensus on regional recreation that suits all jurisdictions' funding capacities for all small communities and larger communities. I ask the CVRD directors take the time to put this on hold and negotiate the current funding needs based on usage and renegotiate the agreements that are about to expire for the Cowichan Aquatic Center that has triggered this regional recreation investigation study. Treating CVRD area like winners and losers only creates animosity between areas instead of building lasting relationships between users of facilities and the area they live in. I'd like to thank you for your time, and my name is Lynn Smith Saltaire. Thank you.
Boy, your timing was perfect. Right on the nose. Thank you. Anyone else who would like to speak? Yes, sir.
Hello. So my name is Kay Morrissey. I'm a new resident in Saltaire, Area G. So we, with other residents in Saltaire, we are quite concerned with the numbers we've seen in the various options. And I'm here to say that we are surprised that option F has been recommended because it is, in our opinion, one of the most unbalanced options. It's creating a few big winners and big losers. The option F uses a principle of proximity that may appeal to administration but makes little sense for us residents. With option F, North Cowichan sees a decrease of 1.2 million, while option A, based on usage only, was a decrease of $268,000. The difference between option A and option F is almost $1 million. It's a big jackpot. The second biggest winner is Ladysmith with 392,000 instead of 72,000 based on usage only. So that's an improvement of 300,000. Whereas the biggest loser is Area G. Option A, based on usage, was proposing a funding of 147,000, where option F pushes the change to 411,000. Overall, the option F appears like a solution that creates even more imbalances than we currently have, overfunding some facilities and burdening areas with the least usage. It doesn't appear fair, especially to Area G residents. We believe that option F supports a type of governance where the winners take it all. In a context where we need to solve problems together, it would be more beneficial to develop relationships between neighbors and find solutions that are balanced and making sense for residents. We support the idea of funding per usage, and I personally think that the option A is a reasonable option that could be a good solution to our problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Michael Wilson. I'd just like to thank you for looking into the minutes that weren't posted on the previous EASC meeting. They are now posted in the correct place, and I've been able to download them. Thank you for looking into that.
Great, thank you. Okay, we can, unless there's anybody else, no? Seeing no one coming forward, we can move to staff report 1. Mr. Elzinga. It's been a voyage already.
It has, Mr. Chair. So, Aisquel, good morning to the board.
Aisquel.
Ainashqualwan, Quanis E. Lamnana. It feels good to see you. I'd like to introduce one staff member who's in the room. I believe Mr. Clayton Postings from Ladysmith will join us as well. But Ernie Mansuetti is the Director of Parks and Recreation for North Cowichan. He's been with me on this voyage, and I'd like to recognize his contributions.
Thank you.
The board made a resolution in October 2015. It was moved and seconded that a report regarding regional recreation be prepared for the board's consideration. It was not unanimous. There were 4 directors opposed. The board then struck a committee. Thanks, Steve. To move through the work of regional recreation. So I'd like to introduce the committee members. So the chair of the committee is Mr. Mel Dory, and on the committee, Mr. Brian Harrison, Al Sebring, Deb Melnick, who's in attendance today, Ian Morrison, Aaron Stone, Allison Nicholson, Mary Marcotte, and Klaus Kuhn. So that's your Regional Recreation Select Committee. The committee broke the work into 4 phases. So the first 2 phases were public engagement and facility use analysis, and the board received those reports in January of this year. So we're into phase 3, and our consultant, Mr. Brian Johnson, will talk more about that. But phase 3 is looking at changes that may be required to create a regional recreation system that included a look at regionalizing recreation services, whatever that means, changes to governance of service, and changes to funding of services. So I'm going to stress that RC Strategies plus PERC was tasked with facilitating a fair funding model for the 9 regionally significant recreation facilities. In phase 3, there were 3 workshops held by the committee. At the end of the second phase 3 workshop, the committee did not achieve consensus, so the committee did attempt a 3rd phase 3 workshop. There was no consensus from the committee in that 3rd workshop. There isn't anticipation that consensus could be achieved at the committee level, and the committee left the consultant to provide a recommendation to the board. So I'm going to emphasize that this is a consultant recommendation with the staff report. and not a report from the committee. I'm also going to stress that staff would be looking for direction if a fair funding model is not achieved today. I'm going to stress that this fallback position of direction to staff is not considered a fair funding model, that it doesn't fix fair funding for all facilities, but may alleviate some of the most important pinch points, including the avoidance of two-tiered fees for the Cowichan Aquatic Center. And I am going to stress that it is, in my understanding, the status quo would lead to North Cowichan and the City of Duncan considering the reintroduction of two-tiered fees for the Cowichan Aquatic Center. The committee and staff did not consider status quo an option. I do note that any changes in funding are anticipated to include a public approval process, and if that process is a referendum in October, then I'm informed by Mr. Berry that June the 13th is the target deadline for first 3 readings of the bylaw, and so we have some work to do. So that's my opening remarks, Mr. Chair, and I'm now going to turn this over to Mr. Brian Johnson from RC Strategies Plus PERC. Brian is, if not one of the most respected recreation professionals in the province. He has done a number of studies for the CVRD, including the last regional master plan, which I believe was in the 1980s. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Brian Johnson.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, all. Pleased to be here to talk about this notion of regional recreation. As John said, whatever that means. Our job was to try and put some parameters on that and try and understand it better. And so what you have before you is a report, and it is from the consultant, not from the committee, because the committee couldn't come to consensus. I've actually summarized part of the report on a single piece of paper, and I handed out a copy to everybody so that you have that. I would just stress none of that is new information put before you at the last minute. It's all simply a summary of what's in the agenda package that was sent out to you in a timely manner. But we, as a group, were charged to look at this thing called regional recreation and come back to a report to the board on that topic. We divided that topic into 3 parts. We looked at the notion of which kinds of cooperative services needed to be more regional or not. We looked at governance issues on a regional basis, and we looked at funding issues on a regional basis. And so I'll just go through those 3. In terms of how much more regional recreation services should be, we developed a kind of a continuum on page 2 of our report. It's called section 2, and it's just a single sheet. I would draw your attention to that page. It really said at one end there is no regional recreation. There are simply a bunch of different recreation agencies all operating independently without any collaboration or cooperation, but all of them would be competing for customers and dealing with user groups, and they would all be managing their own independent, smaller services. So that's kind of one end of the continuum. At the other end of the continuum would be full integration. One recreation agency delivering all services in the regional district for all residents, coordinating all of the facilities and services. And so we just created this continuum for the sake of discussion. And we found that the existing system, while it has a number of different departments in North Cowichan and Ladysmith and the regional district, which operates services in Lake Cowichan and in the south, in the 2 major facilities in the south, while we have a number of different systems, they do cooperate and collaborate to a fair degree already. And we found that the existing model that you've adopted is probably somewhere in the middle of that continuum or towards the right end of that continuum. And as we talked about it, we thought that we're doing things relatively well here in the region in terms of regional cooperation and collaboration. And while there might be some refinements to that, and we might move further to the right, that there was no reason to adopt a complete amalgamation at this point into one department that operated all services. In other words, there was no reason to change significantly in the way services are provided, because we needed to protect that balance of individual separate services for different parts of the region. What I think your first speaker in that open public forum session talked about, that notion of separate services customized to a part of the regional district, some of the reasons why people moved here. We needed to protect that and preserve some of that, while at the same time encouraging cooperation between agencies where it makes sense, and that's happening now, and that's happening to a large degree. The only caveat to that was, and the only reason possibly to change anything, is that much of the cooperation and collaboration right now is happening on the basis of the people involved and their cooperative inclinations, those who make decisions, who are elected to make decisions on our behalf, many of you sitting around the table here, and other municipal councillors, and their interest in collaborating and cooperating with neighboring jurisdictions, and the staff that get along well and meet regularly and cooperate on things like joint service delivery where it makes sense, and dealing with major user groups that need to use all of the arenas where that makes sense, and marketing services, and one registration system so that residents of the region don't have to have separate websites to go to register at different for different kinds of services. All of those kinds of things are happening pretty much now, and so we think that for the most part, services are as regional as they need to be in terms of the service delivery system, and the consultant, me, nor the committee felt that there was much need to make much change there. And so that was the first kind of position we came to. Things are happening quite well. There could be some benefits if we formalized some of that cooperative nature on behalf of individuals into more agreements and policies and structures, but we don't need to change the system and make it more regional. We then looked at governance and what might happen in terms of how services are governed, in other words, the actual system above the service delivery, which is happening quite well. And I would draw your attention to page 5 of our, page 4 of our report, where we talk about some potential small changes to governance, but they only really relate to funding. They're connected to the funding. We don't need to make changes to governance to make systems more regional. We only need to make a few changes if, in fact, you want to change the way services are funded in the regional district. If you did wish, in this third thing, which I'll talk about in a moment, to make some changes to how services are funded, then we believe you would need to respect 3 things that are on that page. And they're fairly fundamental management principles. And that is that those who pay should have responsibility for being involved in governing the service that they pay for. In other words, if we bring in a new jurisdiction to pay for something, then they have to have a say in how it's delivered. If they're going to, we're going to connect responsibility with authority. We're going to connect who pays with who controls. And so that's a fairly elementary thing that I think is fairly consistent in regional districts across the province and has been consistent here too, to a large degree. And secondly, whoever authorizes debt should service debt. And that's just a simple notion that once debt is in place and certain jurisdictions have agreed to pay for it, if we introduce new jurisdictions into funding for a service, they can't be obligated to pay for debt. They may agree to pay for the operation, but not to service debt. And thirdly, if we do change who's involved in governing an individual recreation function, like any of the 9 that we're talking about, then if new people come into those and become involved in funding those things, they can't be obligated to other things as well. If someone agrees to become involved in a function, agreeing to become involved in that function stops at being involved in the function, and they can't be forced in the future to be involved in expanding that function or other functions or new debt associated with the function. That would require a separate authorization. These are very simple things. I think there was a fair amount of agreement on the committee on these things, but again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the committee in any way, shape, or form, and this isn't a committee report. But in those first two areas, I don't think there was much concern, much anxiety, much disagreement at the committee. I think much of it happened at the third part of what we looked at, which is the financing. And so that's where I'll spend more of my time in terms of presentation. And that's where I start referring back to this single page, which summarizes the rest of the report and is now up on the screen in front of you if you wish. And so all this does is a summary of all of the options that the committee looked at and agonized over, I think is not too strong a word, discussed and debated. It starts with the status quo, and then it lists a number of options, and I'll just go through them quickly, and I'll finish with my personal recommendation for your consideration. But what we're talking about here is 9 regionally significant recreation service areas, each attached to a facility. And we're talking about the 13 geopolitical jurisdictions in the regional district, plus a 14th, which is the First Nations, only because they're currently involved in funding at least one of those services. And so that's what this matrix represents, is the summary. If you're interested in what each one of those sections or options is about, you'd have to go back to the breakdown of how that relates in the 9 separate facilities back into the report for more detail. But I'll just try and go through this as quickly as I can. It is complex, though, and I'll just take a few minutes to try and help clarify if I can. And so the first couple of rows there are around this notion of the status quo. So that's who's currently paying for the $15.8 million that are being allocated to these 9 functions. And I've got both the dollar amounts in thousands, and then below it I've got the proportion of the total that each jurisdiction is paying. And so it's fairly simple. Just to take one example of the $15.8 million that's going towards the 9 facilities, if we just look at electoral area A as an example, it's paying $756,000 of that total, which is about 4.8% of the total. And you can go across and see what each of the jurisdictions is now paying, both in dollar terms and in percentage terms. And it's against that base, the status quo, that we started looking at options. And if we go down into option A, the first option, where we would shift from a status quo to financing services on the basis of use, this is where the committee found a significant disconnect between the status quo and what they thought made some sense. A number of committee members really liked the notion of distributing all costs based on use, because they felt it was something clear and simple, transparent, something that you could explain to people and they would understand. And so what we would do is we look at the proportion of all of the use of all 9 facilities, we add up what that would mean in all those, and we come to a total, and that total is represented in these 3 rows that are beside option A. So again, just to take electoral area A as an example, instead of paying $756,000 now, or about 4.8% of the total, if we just based the new funding model across the board for all 9 services on the basis of use, electoral area A would pay $1,066,000, a difference of an extra $310,000, and they would shift from 4.8% of the total up to 6.7% of the total, because they have 6.7% of the use of all of the 9. So this would be a shift. And again, we can go across the board on this one. we're spending the same amount of money, but it's coming from different jurisdictions. If we just said, let's shift to use. As you can see, there would be some big shifts. Anything over $50,000 I put in bold, and any shift in the percentages that's more than 2% I put in bold. And so you can see here that there's some quite significant shifts across the board. In fact, there are 12 bolded differences in the difference column. So 12 of the 14 jurisdiction would actually have significant increases or decreases. And we would shift a lot of money from one to the other. If you add all the positives, it comes to about 1.8 million, and all the negatives, it comes to about 1.8 million. So they cancel each other out, and we're spending the same amount of money net, but a lot of taxes are going up collectively across the region, about 1.8 million, and a lot are going down, and that would be about 1.8 if you look at all of the jurisdictions. So it's quite a substantial shift. There would be, in that case, 8 winners and 6 losers, but there are winners and losers in any change from the status quo. But it would be significant. Again, I would say many of the committee members liked the notion of shifting to the basis of use for a number of reasons, but when they saw how much difference it would make in all of the significant increases and all of the significant decreases, they found that the shift was so great that it wasn't something the committee could support. So we looked at other options. We looked at an option B, which is taking that same amount of money and shifting it to the basis of population, which has been done elsewhere in the province, and it is an option. Some jurisdictions actually shift to population, or a combination of population and taxable assessment is being used in a few regional districts across the province. But we just looked at population by itself, and again, if you shift from status quo to option B, the apportioning the same amount of money, but now on the basis of where the population centers are, you can see, and if I just take my electoral area A as the same example to try and illustrate what that row is about, in option B, electoral area A would shift from $756,000 to $900,000, and difference of an increase of $144,000, and a difference, instead of paying 4.8% of the total, they would be paying 5.7% of the total. So their taxes would go up, and other taxes would go up, and some would come down. In this case, we also have 12 bolded numbers, and we have 8 winners and losers, but they're a different set of winners and losers if we built this on the basis of population.
Just going to, I've got a couple of people who want to ask questions,
Okay.
but I'm wondering if we can wait for Mr. Johnson to finish, or Director Davis?
I'm at your pleasure.
I guess once he gets down to F, because I have some questions about how he got A and D to equal F.
Okay. I'll explain that
Sure.
as I go through. Thank you. So again, in option B, there's actually even more tax shift. Instead of 1.8 million tax increase and 1.8 million tax decrease to get us to a zero net sum as we shift some winners and some losers, in this case on population, the net was 2.235 positive and negative. And again, we have 12 very significant tax shifts, even more significant than in A. And so when the committee looked at B, they discounted it. This was the only one they seemed to discount fairly easily. And again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the committee. I'm just reciting what was happening in terms of process at committee workshops. But option B did not get much play at all. It seemed like this was not something people wanted to discuss very much. This was discounted fairly early in the discussion. Option C, taking that same amount of money but apportioning it on the basis of taxable assessment, was another option. It was identified as an option only because about 90% or 95% of all public services in this province at the municipal and regional level are use this way of apportioning costs. It's the most common of all the way of apportioning costs. Certainly the vast majority of public services are funded this way. It's at the heart of our tax system. And if we looked at option B, again, there are a number of winners and losers. There are a number of very significant increases and very significant decreases. And just to take my electoral area A as the example again, in option C, electoral area A, if we based it only on taxable assessment, would go from 756,000 currently all the way up to 1,074,000 in total, an increase of 318,000. So this is the largest increase so far for electoral area A. And they would shift from 4.8% of the total to 6.8% of the total. It's just on that margin of 2%. And so it's not bold, but if we look at all of the winners and losers there, all 14 of those jurisdictions are now bolded. So in fact, there is a significant shift upwards or downwards in all of the jurisdictions across the board. And there are, in fact, 5 that go up and 9 that go down. Yeah, but obviously the 5 that go up a lot in order to equal the 9 that go down. So the tax increases are really focused, and they're really in specific areas if we based on taxable assessment. And the total shift in option C is about 1.967. So it's quite a significant overall tax shift as well. Option D, apportioning costs based on proximity. This is something that we looked at where we just said, what is your closest facility? And let's take everybody and get them to pay for the closest facility. So the closest pool, so you would pay for one pool of the 2 that exist in the regional district, the closest arena of all of the ice surfaces, the closest community center, the closest performing arts center, of which there is only one, so everybody would pay for it. But this based on proximity was something that we thought might have some merit, and so we did a workup on that. And when we looked at that, option D, there was less tax shift overall. There was still 5 winners and 9 losers, but the winners would have very significant tax decreases, and the losers would be more spread out over all of the 9. Over all of the jurisdictions. And to just again explain that, take my electoral area A as the example to try and explain the row. In this case, based only on proximity, electoral area A, paying for the closest community center, being Shawnigan Lake, the closest arena being Kerry Park, and then the closest pool and performing arts center here in Duncan, and the Cowichan Sportsplex. They would pay, they would shift from 756,000 currently all the way up to 986,000, and so their taxes would go up collectively in electoral area A by 230,000. Because that's over 50,000, it's in bold, and their portion of the tax bill would shift from 4.8% up to 6.2%, just to show you how that line works. And of course, everybody can look at their own and see, but there's only 9 bolded in this option D instead of all 12. And so the total shift is about 1.26 million tax increases and tax decreases. So this is the smallest amount of tax shift so far down the list. If we look at option E, this is based on a kind of a hierarchy of services model. So this is adopted generally in municipalities and regional districts in a number of places across the province. So what we looked at here was we took 3 of the 9 that were planned, conceived, and originally justified and operate very much regionally in scope. They are unique in the region. They draw users from across the region, and that's the Performing Arts Centre, the Island Savings Centre, and the Cowichan Sportsplex. And we took those and said everybody will pay for those because they're regional in scope. And then we said after that, everybody uses arenas and pools, or most of the jurisdictions use arenas and pools, all but 1 or 2. And so you would pay for your closest one of those, but only one of those. And then everybody would pay for their own community center, of which there is one in all of the areas of the regional district, a regionally significant community center funded by the regional district or funded by a municipality. And so in that case, it's kind of like a hierarchical approach. Everybody pays for the ones that are regional. People share in the costs of the ones that are kind of sub-regional, and the ones that are more local, everybody pays for their own on. And so that's a different kind of funding model. When we looked at option E, there are, in fact, 9 winners and 4 losers. There's 11 in bold, which means 11 would have a significant increase or decrease. There's a big tax shift. It's about $2.435 million altogether, more than option D. And so we looked at that, and that didn't receive a whole lot of play at committee level, but it was something to look at. Just to explain again, option A, in option A, if we look at this hierarchy of service, electoral area A would shift from 756,000 up to 1.22 million, an increase of 464,000, and a shift from 4.8% of the total all the way up to 7.7% of the total. So when you look at the big shifts in percentage terms, it's A and C going up, and it would be G and H going up, and it would be Ladysmith going up, and it would also be North Cowichan going up in that case, sorry, going down in that case. So that was option E. We discussed these first 5 options at a workshop. The committee couldn't come to consensus. They gave me some direction to go away, and I came up with a number of other options. We discussed those at a 3rd workshop. One of them had some play, and it's now called option F, and it's been refined since that 3rd option as well. But in option F, a number of things happen. First of all, we took out capital. In the 2nd workshop, a number of the committee members said, let's take out capital and only focus on operating dollars. Some capital had already come out. Even when we were looking at the 15.793 million, North Cowichan was still separately spending about 1.445 million in debt service charges for the Aquinas, the Aquatic Center, but and that was never part of the equation. But in this case, we took other capital out, debt service charges out in other facilities, and we said, let's just look at the capital, at the operating cost. And so now we're dealing with a total of 15.285 million, not 15.79 million. So we've taken out all of the capital, and we're just only left with straight across the board operating costs. And so that's one of the things that's happened in option F. And then we combined 2 thoughts. We combined proximity and use. And what we said was, let's use the proximity model, which in the first 5 had the least amount of tax transfer up and down. It's the one that only had 1.263 million in pluses and 1.263 million minuses to come to 0. And so it had the least of the first 5 options we looked at. Let's take that and let's use proximity, but let's add in the caveat that everybody pays for the closest facility unless they don't use it. And so that's this business of use. The only concession to use here was that if use when we registered total use across the board, if a jurisdiction didn't use a facility, we took it out even if it was close. Okay? So that actually pulled out a couple of jurisdictions for paying for things that they might otherwise pay because they were close. But if they're not using it, we said, let's not ask them to pay for it. So in option F, what we have is we're now shifting from status quo to this primarily proximity, but also use model, taking capital debt service charges out. And that's what that row looks like. So again, to show what electoral area A would pay in option F, it shifts from $756,000 up to 1.106 million, an increase of 350,000, and they go from 4.8% up to 7.2% of tax increase.
Director
quite a
Jackson is
significant
asking
one.
for an example, and Director Jackson, can you explain exactly of what?
You had just spoken about that even if the facility were very close, but if that community didn't use it, it was taken out, and I was wondering if you could give us an example
Certainly.
of that. Thank you.
I'm just going to point people to the report, because there is a breakdown example in the report, and it's on page... No, this is a good clarification. So if you go to page 7, for example, so I'm going to go down for, I'm looking at G and H now, okay? And I'm going down the columns of G and H, and their closest community center and swimming pool is Frank Jameson, so both G and H would pay for that. You can see they go from, in the case of G, it goes from $40,000 up to $318,000 if we break that on the basis of proximity. And if we look at electoral area H, it goes from 91,000 all the way up to 304,000 as their closest swimming pool and community center. But if we go down one more to Fuller Lake Arena, electoral area G pays for its portion of that, but electoral area H did not use Fuller Lake Arena, and so even though it's the closest arena, it drops off that equation. Does that answer your question as an example? Okay, thank you. I'm going to go back up to the sheet that's on display then. So that's option F. It has a total tax shift of about $1.87 million in total. It has 7, the tax increases are going up in 7 jurisdictions. They're coming down in 6. And let's look at where those tax increases are going up. They're going up in A and C. They're coming down a little bit in B. They're going up significantly in D. They're coming down in Duncan. They're going up in E. They're going up significantly in G and H. They're going up a little bit in Lake Cowichan. And then they come down quite significantly in Ladysmith and North Cowichan. That's fairly common in terms of where they're going up and where they're coming down. That's fairly common in a number of these options. If you look at all of the options, G and H have tax increases in all of the options. They're not paying their proportionate share of taxable assessment, of use, of population, of proximity, of any of those. And so if we used any of those options, taxes would go up in those 2 jurisdictions. And a winner in all of the options, if you can call them winners, it's a callous term, and I'm sorry to use it, but I think that's a fair descriptor, would be North Cowichan, for example, where their taxes come down in all of the options because, in fact, they're paying more than their share of use, more than their share of population, more of their share of proximity, more of their share of of taxable assessment. And so I think there's some common elements to all of these options. I'm just raising them now as you look at option F. Option F, in fact, raises a number of and satisfies a number of pinch points, what we thought, what was commonly used in the committee discussion of pinch points. And again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the committee, but this notion that G&H need to pay more in no matter what the option is, the taxes in North Cowichan will come down, and they will be a beneficiary. In the case of F, also Ladysmith their taxes will come down because G&H will help to pay for that center. But also A and C are going up and B is coming down, and that's a fairly common kind of thing, as A and C are now paying for Shawnigan where they're not currently, but they're also, a big part of that increase is to pay for the aquatic center in A, B, C, D is part of the reason in F for all of those increases across that, and E, which is a major factor in terms of what we're calling option F. We don't have a specific recommendation from the committee, but the consultant has said that option F represents a reasonable approach, a fair approach, a transparent approach, a defensible approach, an approach that makes sense where you distribute costs based on proximity unless people don't use it, and then the costs are levied on the basis of taxable assessment in each jurisdiction once their proportion is established. And so this is something that would be fairly, I think, defensible. And so personally, I thought it had some merit and had recommended it. But I also added 2 caveats to that, and they're the bottom 2 sections. And what that, in my report, I say is that if you thought option F was in fact going in the right direction, if the right jurisdictions were paying more and the right jurisdictions were paying less, and it became a fairer approach overall, but you were very concerned about the magnitude, you might say as a board, and again, you'll make your own decisions, but you might say as a board, we want to go in that direction, but we're not going to bite it all off in this decision. We will bite a portion of it off in this decision. And so I had offered the option of going halfway down the road to a fairer system, or a third of the way down the road to a fairer system. And if, in fact, if you only went a third of the way down the road to a fairer system, that's the very bottom of that chart, where, in fact, taxes would go up in A by 117,000 and in B by 110,000, and electoral B would be the beneficiary as taxes are going up to fund others that are going down, but all of them are helping to pay for the aquatic center as well. And the other big tax shifts would be G and H, where they're helping to pay for, in one case, both the Fuller Lake and the Frank Jameson, and in the other case, just the Frank Jameson, and helping to pay for that community center and pool. And the main beneficiaries are Ladysmith because G&H is helping, and North Cowichan because others are helping to pay for the aquatic center. That seemed to me to kind of hit at the core of what I felt committee members were saying needed to happen in terms of direction with the least amount of overall impact. And so it's offered for your consideration. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much. Very well presented. Mr. Elzinga?
Yes, thank you again to RC Strategies and PERC and Mr. Brian Johnson. So that concludes our presentation, Mr. Chair. I'm just informing the board respectfully that if there are questions around any of these 6 funding models, that they probably should be directed to Brian Johnson. If there are questions about what happens if we don't achieve consensus on any of those funding models, they would probably be directed toward myself. So, and we are anticipating questions.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Director Stone first, and then Director Davis.
Oh, where to start? Well, I will start by saying that I appreciate the process that all of the committee members and the staff went through. I felt like in some ways I may have been a fair weather committee member. I was probably only there for portions or the majority of half of the meetings. But that said, I followed it closely and read all the reports and reread them and made notes. In the last meeting, although I wasn't able to stay to the end, I think we heard a lot of good things. Unfortunately, I don't feel we ever took a more nuanced look at the way how things ended up the way that they are today. And maybe what the mistakes were made at those times when those agreements were made that may have prevented some of this even being necessary. The agreements that we have with Area G and H at the time, I would assume made good sense, but there was no sort of tying of those agreements to assessment over time or something that could have allowed it to sort of keep pace with some of the growing costs at a less impactful way. I thought the apportion or the use analysis was very telling. It did show that we in fact have sort of a central regional facility, I call the Performing Arts Center, generally supported that based on usage, but showed that we clearly had, you know, sort of 4 sub-regions within the regional district in terms of where people direct their recreation initiatives. So you have, you know, north, south, west, and central. Central picks up a little bit more of it. North Cowichan, obviously, and all the funding models would be the beneficiary of some equalization because as the big sort of center, they've got some of the bigger facilities, and we all use them a little bit from time to time. With Tyson growing up over the last 13 years, it was a treat to go to the aquatic center instead of our pool. So it would happen once or twice a year, but generally they had passes at our own local pool. It seemed pretty clear to me that with the diversity in geography and the usage patterns that we had, that a more regional and sub-regional solution would have been preferred. I'm disappointed that we don't see any recommendation that would address that central, south, west, and north, with the significant regional facility being the Performing Arts Center. I had hoped that a hybrid model based on what I saw was the clarity of the data showing the usage patterns had actually generally supported a sub-regional reorganization of funding. And I wish that this had come forward as an option. I would have supported a baseline usage, for example, a model based on the usage that we see today, then keyed to assessment or something for budgeting purposes in the future. So a sub-regional proposal that really recognized the usage patterns, but then key it from this day forward on assessments so that we could keep pace with changes in growth in different areas of the region, and maybe review use every 10 years. I support the governance piece in the report. There's no way that I would ask anybody to formalize a long-term agreement around funding without giving them a voice at the table. But looking at all of these options, those recommended here, and even the usage patterns, I can't see the residents of Ladysmith, and I can't in good faith support giving up control of our own recreation center to the regional district to save 1 or 2% of taxation. I don't think our residents would support it, and I think if going to referendum with that would be a recipe for failure. And more than anything, I don't support such a dramatic change in funding to the electoral areas that I'm neighboring with. I can only speak directly to the agreements that we have with Area G and H, but I would echo the sentiments of our speakers this morning that although that is the closest, when I look down at, say, option F, I can't even fathom Area G paying $411,000 more or Area H paying $300,000 more. That is neither equitable nor fair to those rural areas, even though they may be in some cases, like in the Diamond, sort of an extension of Ladysmith, or in the northern part of Saltaire, with Ladysmith addresses often considered sort of a sub-rural area of Ladysmith. So I see that the closest to reality would be 1/3 of option F, but again, it doesn't address the inequities that are in the southern end of the regional district. I can't speak to the agreements that those directors or those regions have with each other, but none of option F really addresses the inequities based on usage that exist in the south end, or the south to the central. And then there's, places like Area E that are sort of caught in the middle of this whole melee. Unfortunately, then I just don't feel that I can support it. I don't see an option here that I feel that I can support. If we had had another option come forward that sort of respected what I thought I heard consistently as we came to the conclusion of the process, that it was a significant regional facility in the middle and some sub-regional agreements, areas F and I pay a disproportionate amount, but much of those payments are trees. So, you know, when we needed to look at how it impacts a residential tax holder or a commercial tax holder. Those agreements were made in recognition, I believe, having talked to the directors and staff, based on that big forestry tax piece. And it seemed like they were okay at the time to put some of that burden on the forestry companies to help support those forestry-reliant communities in the West. So I hope that an alternative resolution comes forward. I see that Director Morrison has put some thought into this, and although it saddens me to think that we've spent maybe a year and a half to get hardly anywhere, I can't support any of the recommendations or options that are on this sheet, and it saddens me to think that we were unable to come up with a more creative, nuanced model that respected the previous agreements, the sub-regional nature of our regional district, and the geographic and usage diversity that we have. So I'm happy to sit down with Director Dory and Director Marcotte, or whoever's at the table come next time, and talk about how we move over time to a more equitable funding solution, but I can't support any of the options that have been presented to us.
Thank you. Director Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and yeah, it's been quite a challenge here. I was just wondering was there a threshold for removing a facility due to proximity? What was the percentage on that?
Excellent question. I didn't mention the threshold we picked. We looked at all of the usage data, and it seemed like there was a kind of a cut at 2%. So we used 2% as the threshold. So if in phase 2 of this process, where we measured use of each of the 9 facilities and where users were coming from, if less than 2% were from an area, we concluded they were almost de facto not using it, and so that was the threshold we used for a couple of reasons. One, that it seemed like there was quite a bit of use significantly above 2% and below 2%, but we weren't there was very little conflict in choosing 2%. And also 2% was roughly the margin of error for that data. One of the problems in using usage as a basis for apportioning costs is the margin of error in measuring use, and then the frequency with which you have to measure it. So that's why most of the regional districts in the province do not use it. But if you were to use it, you would have to measure periodically and tolerate a margin of error. And the margin of error is likely plus or minus 2 to 3%. So that's why we chose that. So we discounted jurisdictions from paying for something if they didn't use it, and the definition of didn't use was less than 2% in the phase 2 of this process.
Thank you. And it was just, when I was looking through this at some of the numbers for option F and then looking at option A and D, like for area A, which is my area,
Yeah.
Option A is percentage pay of 6.7.
Yeah.
Option D is 6.2. And normally I would think that some combination of that would end up with a number in between, but in option F, it's 7.2, so it's gone up a lot.
Yeah.
And with North Cowichan, it's got 36.2 and 37.7 for A and D, and not anywhere in between. It's down at 30 for F. And I
so
guess that's the debt that's been removed.
Correct. And also in option 7, while we're saying it's a basis of proximity and use, we're not putting many eggs in the basket of use, which is why it doesn't come out as kind of an average of those two.
And also, like, Kerry Park doesn't have very much debt, which is our huge, because we're at that point in the life and the rebuilding of the center, which was neglected for many, well, not neglected, but improvements were put off due to a couple of things. Yes.
So capital items and transfers to reserves for future life cycle maintenance or retrofits were included in operating costs. It was only debenture debt, short and long-term debt, that we took out of the capital.
And just on the community center proximity, like areas A and C have had their own community centers for pretty close to a century now, the Mill Bay Community Hall and the Shawnigan Lake Cobble Hill Farmers Institute Hall. So, and looking at the usage of the Shawnigan Lake Community Center by areas A and C, it's like 8 and 3%. Yet by these models, we would be expected to pay 24 and 23% of it.
Yep.
And in the discussion earlier, there was talk about governance. So by that, if there were a Shawnigan Lake Community Center commission of 7 people, 2 would be from Area A and 2 would be from Area C. So we could gang up and outvote the Area B, the 3 on Area B. So knowing the Area B people like I do, I don't think they would be in favor of that kind of a model.
If in fact you went to 2, 2, and 3, that would be the case. If you went to 1, 1, and 5, that would offer a different option. But yes, that's correct. What you could do, if you wanted to look at the a true, take half the costs and distribute them on the basis of use and half on the basis of something else like proximity, you could just average those 2 numbers. In other words, add up from each of those how much you should pay in option B and in option D, and then divide by 2, and that would be the new number if in fact you wanted to divide half the costs on one basis and half on another. We didn't look at that, but we did look at a sub-regional model, which is in fact the proximity model. So further to the previous comment, option D is in fact the 4 sub-regional models, and then option E, just so you know, is taking that proximity but taking out some of the higher level ones like the performing arts and making them shared by everybody. So that's, in fact, there's lots of different information here that can be used to create your own model if you want, but there's also lots of stuff here that works by itself.
Thank you. Just, I'm going to get back to this in just 1 second, but I just want to let you know, at the Island Savings Center Commission, we have representatives from Area D and Area E, and certainly other people on that commission can speak for themselves, but there are 2 representatives from Duncan, 3 from North Cowichan, and 1 from each of the areas. I'm amazed at how well it works in terms of getting agreement on what we do for the facility and for the community. So I just, from my experience, I would not be afraid of that, having a commission that is responsible for the facility.
I guess my big concern was the usage, and Cobble Hill's pretty married to its community center and Mill Bay to its. So if you did end up getting militant people on the commission in some fashion, it could completely stall out anything Area B could do. But.
And at the committee, it was clear that there are lots of other facilities in other areas of the regional district, like there is in the south, that were not part of this 9 facilities that were regionally significant and paid for by the regional district or taxpayers within the regional district or its members. And there are many other community halls that weren't part of this study.
Thank you. Director Acton and Director Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious about what kind of census was taken because we have 84,000 people in the region, 54% are in the municipalities. And I'm also curious as to how much the Place Speak engagement was involved, because what I saw on there over and over again was people wanted to recreate outside more. So therefore, people are not getting in their cars. They want to go to the trails, and that's what communities are building on, is parks and trails. And I also would like to see, so that to me means if you're driving less and you're staying more in your area, a sub-regional approach. And I appreciate the fact that Director Stone brought up old agreements, and I know we have many in the south, and bringing those old agreements to the table and saying, you know, do these still work for us now? And because I question those numbers, the 3% and 9 or whatever it was that Director Davis said for Shawnigan Lake Community Center. I'm in there very often in the morning, and there's a kids group every morning, and there's people from all over, because that's what they offer there. And so.
So
Okay,
there's
go
a
ahead.
couple of parts to the question. In terms of gauging use, we actually went to the facilities and we gauged use at the facility. So we talked to those people as they were exiting a facility, if they were in a drop-in mode. We looked at where they lived, if they registered for a program, and we also looked at addresses for user groups that rent space in a facility. So that was kind of a facility-by-facility analysis of use. That's how we got percentages of use. But the Place Speak and the public survey, where we got literally thousands of inputs from thousands of residents of the regional district, we were asking a variety of questions about, not just about use, but we were asking about satisfaction levels, needs, wants, where they want to go, testing ideas about regional recreation. And what we found there we found a lot of good stuff, but some of the themes that emerged were, there was a real growing interest in outdoor recreation, absolutely. And in phase 4 of this process, the master plan, that's one of the things we really want to hit on and talk about how we can develop more opportunities outdoors. And that's consistent around the province, just so you know. But there's also other themes. One theme was a real interest in becoming more regionally coordinated. The notion of people willing to travel within their subregion and outside of their subregion to recreate, and the need for kind of one-stop shopping of information, and more the notion of let's have a regional district-wide, a region-wide look at recreation and needs and services, and making sure that all the opportunities I might want are available to me, even if only a portion of them are available in my community center or my subregion. That was a real theme that we found from residents as well, and that was a strong one. So we're going to use all of that information from phase 1 in this to build a master plan to respond to those many other issues independent of the funding.
So, sorry, I still don't have a sense of the numbers of how many people you actually spoke to compared to the population, or.
And I don't have those figures with me, and that was part of the presentation on January 25th, but we had a very high response rate to the questionnaire that we sent out. And we also had very good participation at a bunch of community events we attended and at the Place Speak situation. And we're talking tens of thousands. Certainly, from an industry standard survey point of view, we had so much good input from the public survey that we were able to say it properly represented all of the 80-some thousand residents of the regional district within plus or minus about 4 or 5% at 95% level of confidence. We had sufficient numbers to be able to apply a confidence level using a standard research methodology.
So
we're
just to be
different.
clear, this is not an exact process, correct? I mean, you can't, the amount of work that would have to be done to know exactly how many people from area A are using a facility in area B would take an enormous amount of work. So this is a methodology to come to a number that you can be reasonably confident in.
Yeah, that's the part I don't feel reasonably confident in. But it's, regardless, I don't see an option for Area B, even though we are technically a winner in all of those. So that's, I would have liked to have seen a more sub-regional approach, or even a two-tier system. Is that just something we
So
don't want to bring up?
The sub-regional approach is option D, and the two-tier approach is option E. So in the proximity model, option D, we did look at kind of the north, south, central, and west as the 4 jurisdictions, and then people kind of paying for services within each of their subregions. And in option E, we took some of those out as a hierarchical kind of everybody would pay, like the Performing Arts Center. So that's the hybrid approach. But the subregion approach is option D. It's just labeled proximity, but it's a subregion approach.
Okay, thank you, Director Morrison. You're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a really tough meeting to have because The committee members lived and breathed this. I probably read each of the reports a couple of times just so I clearly understood it. I'll share with the committee and for Director Acton's benefit. I want to thank you and your staff because I think this is some of the best data collection and usable information that we've had in the time that I've been here. So, you know, I'm not questioning the data. I even made a note here that this was most useful. This exercise was most useful. I found the information to be very accurate, and we did find a few anomalies in the data, and they were, for the most part, found and corrected. And I'm just going to speak in a general nature because what came from, I attended the Cowichan Lake meeting where your staff were there and the questions were posed. And the sense that I got, and I think it was reflected in a lot of the reports and the workshops that we had, that, you know, we're not dealing with a really broken system. I think we had some discussion about this report and some other things at our Cowichan Lake Recreation meeting last night. And we kind of like the format and the work we're doing and our equipment and our facilities. And so it's if it's not broken, don't fix it. But I think we all recognize that there's some frayed ends that need some attention. So I think that going from that perspective, you know, we can move forward and maybe get some of the jurisdictions that are part of that frayed end to work. I'm gonna just make a couple other comments in that I think in this scenario that's being proposed, and I know there's nothing on the floor yet, but you know, there's winners and losers, and even some of the scenarios in which my electoral came out as a big winner, you know, it didn't sit right, because our neighbors and colleagues around the table would have ridiculous numbers to go to their community with. None of these set right. And that was the sense that I got coming out of these workshops, and I was there for most of it. So I just want to suggest this to the board that, and thank you, Brian, for clarifying that this is the consultant's view. This is staff report consultant's view. I spoke to one of the other committee members, Brian Harrison, this morning. We've got Klaus and Aaron and Mary and Mel, and who I'm interested, thank you as well. I think that I recommended against Brian bringing the full meal deal financial package to it because we can be here all day. The scenarios are vast and complex. I would suggest listen carefully to the committee members. I put a lot of effort into it. I know most of the committee members came prepared, knew the material, had great questions throughout, challenged Brian on a lot of what he was putting forward, and that's why we got the first bundle of recommended options. And then it was, nope, that isn't right, but what if we tried a lot? So please consider what the committee members are sharing. I'm not going to go into the various models. You've got a piece of paper that I distributed that reflected what I thought we came out of it there with. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm anticipating hearing the comments from the rest of the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Just anybody who has put their hand up, I have you on the list, so stay calm. Director Marcotte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to be brief. I haven't got a lot to say. I am agreeing with the fact that the way we recreate today is very different than how we recreated at a time that these expensive facilities were constructed. So that portion is quite, it is a key position in my mind that we need to really look at what we really need and what we really want, and not just take the easy way. But I'm also wanting to discuss a little bit about the Area H and Area G thing that keeps coming up. I'm going to say that it was in the late 1970s, Area H actually went to referendum to state whether they wanted to participate with the town of Ladysmith under an agreement to construct the Frank Jameson Center. 64% of my people came back saying yes. So I don't have trouble when I know that they were solid then. That doesn't mean that today's person is the same as yesterday's person, because we do recreate differently. But with that kind of a consensus from my community, I have no trouble saying that, yes, we have been paying our fair share all the way. On the other hand, Area G didn't even participate at all in the beginning. They ended up, Area H has paid more than twice as much every year in the budget since that time has happened. So I think that Area H needs to have some of that. To me, it's just not fair. And we have paid, literally, you could see it in my book, budget book, that we paid twice as much as Area G all along. So I think we've paid our way in. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you for that. Director Dory.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was the chair of the committee, so I was there front and center through all the discussion. I really value all of the numbers that came out of all of the studies that have been done, and all the work that Brian and his staff have done. There's a history behind the Saltair contribution to Frank Jameson. It hinges on a lot of things, but I think today we realize that we have to pay more, and I think we want to pay more. We want to negotiate with Ladysmith and come up with a fair number, and we want to carry our own weight and as far as use and that sort of thing. So I think we have a willing conveyor of services, and we're willing to negotiate a fair price. So I think the sentiment is that the CVRD is a big brother sort of thing, and some of the municipalities are. So there's always a leery approach to what they're doing and how they're doing it to us. And obviously, the municipalities could carry the vote in this quite easily. All of these centers have been set up legally with referendums and legislation and public consent, and I've never heard any members of the public really complain about the amount of taxes that they're paying compared to another area. They're just happy to have a place to go. The people in Saltair recreate a little differently than other areas. We have only 1.2% of participation in recreation centers, period. We have nice trails and parks, and we have our new community center now that's taking away, I guess, some of the stuff from Fuller Lake Arena where they rented out space to there. So the Saltair people are recreating more at home than they did before. We have Thetis Island. And if they're faced with a $400,000 bill and they never ever use the thing, they're going to say, "What's cooking here? Why?" You know. And they've already got heavy taxation from the Islands Trust, and they pay into a lot of our functions besides. When it comes to option F, it just doesn't help us at all. In fact, it's very, very scary. Ladysmith uses Frank Jameson 62.6% of the time. Under the new system, they would only pay 48.7% of the time, of the money. Saltair uses it 3.9% of it, and they would pay 24%. So some of the numbers just don't fit with Saltair, and we want to pay our fair share. We want to work with Mayor Stone and Ladysmith to do it. I'm glad all the numbers come out to support negotiations, and that would be just the way we would want to go, rather than having Big Brother telling us what we're going to do, what we're going to pay, and it just it's not helpful. I know that people in Solitaire have, we have 2 websites that follow all the current affairs. All of this, all these numbers are on the websites. So they would be very devastated if we followed through with, say, with option F and the rest of it, and you would see a steady stream here of Solitaire people like you have over the community center. So thank you. Probably have other things I could say, but that are relevant, but I'll leave it up to others.
Thank you. Director Yanni DiNardo.
Whoa, it's kind of deja vu. Thank you, Mr. Chair. 10 years ago, I sat here with like a deer in the headlights over the 2-tiered system and was throwing in a lot of different things. And it was obvious we're back to the same. Like, why did we ask for a regional recreation when we're the same at the same? Why did we ask for this? There was a lot of time wasted and money wasted. We need to move forward. This is, I come from a community with no meeting space, no community hall, and I sit on both commissions, and I think they're both valuable. And my community, when the 2-tiered system was in, was devastated. So they realized, and also there was a South End said no to a pool. We realized that parks and trails are valuable. We realized we don't need another pool to pay all the operating costs and how expensive they are. And then we sit around a table that we're supposed to be a Cowichan Valley Regional District, and we're supposed to think regionally. And I came in thinking regionally and got a pretty smackdown lesson right off the top. But I really feel that we have to move forward now, and we have to make decisions, and we have to start to collaborate, because otherwise the next committee is going to come in and ask for another regional recreation report. I mean, this is ridiculous. Let's move on to something. Not status quo is not appropriate. And I think that option F, it is a better one, but I really think that we have to, yeah, the data is useful. Useful for what? It's useful to come out with a conclusion. We have to come out with a conclusion. We have to, it's an election year, okay? It's gonna be not fair for some people because we gotta stand on our soapbox right now. But I really think that we have to, sometimes it's hard as a director, many times it's hard, that you actually have to make these decisions. Today is a day we have to make a decision. We have to make a decision that there's regional recreation, and we sit around a table. We don't, some of us, if we're in Cowichan Valley Regional District, we are here. We're not in Nanaimo. Maybe we should be, but we're here. We need to participate, and we need to pay our fair share, and we need to think of the community and all the people that use all the services. And I think that we need to move today, and we don't need to stand on our soapbox. We don't need to be in our election mode. We need to think of this as a fair and equitable system, and we need to move forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Director Sebring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was vice chair of the committee, and I'm here just as a
alternate.
An alternate, kind of an accident of fate. The regular who sits here is ill today, so it's kind of nice that I get to participate because I know this file reasonably well, given my history with the committee. Director Stone said something earlier about decisions that had been made over time and some of the history that accompanies this file. I mean, we all know that there's a history going back 25, 30, 40 years of trying to crack this nut, and previous boards haven't been able to do it. And based on what I'm hearing around the table today, and based on the piece of paper we received from Director Morrison at the start of the meeting, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to solve it today. The point of the history, I think, is well taken, and I don't want to revisit previous decisions, but I'm going to. An example for me is the notion that the Aquatic Center, and I said this in 2008, and I've been saying it ever since, it's a great facility, but it never should have been built until we had agreement regionally to fund it, to do that at the outset. But we didn't, so we are now in the position that we're in. I look at the charts that are provided, and Brian, by the way, thank you for an excellent report and a great process with the committee. I look at the report that was provided and I see two electoral areas that contribute in the range of 0.5% to recreation in this district. And then I look at the District of North Cowichan contributing 37% to recreation in this district. That's a fairly large discrepancy. I grant you, North Cowichan's the big player in the room, and we should probably be paying more than 0.5%. But, you know, to people who say we don't want to pay because we've never paid, I would respectfully say to them, you know, maybe the approach might be to come to the table and say, thank you for 30 years of subsidizing the use that's been going on from our electoral areas. And then let's move forward with something that's more equitable. And there's a number of models that are proposed that are more or less more equitable. The committee did not settle on option F. The consultant did. That was based on the discussions we had at the committee level, and yes, there were some recommendations that we try to do this more sub-regionally, that the 5 areas that were identified earlier, north-south, or 4 areas, north, south, west, and central, kind of do their own sub-regional thing, and that's partly included in F with the notion of the proximity piece. You know, and then I see that option F has a couple of sub-options that we can go halfway or a third of the way. I would hope that today we do something, that we not punt this into Never Never Land where a future board has to look at it again. Now, we may not be able to come up with an absolute agreement on a funding formula. Or maybe the funding formulas that are proposed even in F sub 1 or 2 are too rich for some of the electoral areas. Maybe we need to consider a phase-in. Maybe we need to say, you know what, we understand, and Director Young-DiNardo referenced the fact that it's an election year, and yes, I understand that makes it awkward for some of the regional directors. But we need to understand that this needs to be addressed, and we are going to address this over time. Let's say, for example, that we end up with option F halfway, and that we commit this board and this organization to saying, you know, and we're going to do that over 5 years, or we're going to do that over 7 years. Oh, God, who knows? Maybe we're going to do it over 10 years, but we're going to move in a direction rather than just sit here spinning our wheels like we've been spinning our wheels for the last 30 years. Let's set a direction at this table to say, that's where we want to go. How we're going to get there and how long it's going to take, maybe we should discuss that among ourselves, but let's get somewhere rather than just stay stuck in the mud that we've been stuck in for forever. You know, Director Dory said we never hear complaints about the relative tax allotments for recreation. Well, I'll tell you, that's because residents of North Cowichan have no idea that they're paying 37% and 2 electoral areas are paying about 0.5% each between them. If they knew, we'd be getting complaints at the North Cowichan table. But it is what it is. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And those of you who've put your hand up for the second time, I'm going through the people who haven't spoken first, but I have you on the list. So I have Director Jackson.
Thank you very much. Just to support what Director Young-DiNardo said, I don't know how many of you were elected when George Cuff came to town, maybe a dozen years ago. And I remember many of the regional directors at that point turning pale and almost throwing up when he said, even if you are a regional director, you must act in the best interest of the region as a whole. If you act only in the best interest of your area, then you are actually breaking the law. Just a little reminder from George Cuff. Now, I know that some of the directors here would like to stay with the status quo, but the reason why this keeps on coming back, why it's been an albatross around our necks for over 30 years, is because the status quo is not fair. And before I go on any further, I want to reframe some of the language that's been used around the table. I'd like us to stop using the words winners and losers. It's like you're on a teeter-totter and the person that's up here is the winner and the person that's down here is a loser. What we want to do is start working towards some equity. Maybe not complete equity, but like Director Sebring has said, move towards something that's more equitable, so something that's more balanced. I never liked the two-tier. I thought it punished families based on the decisions that were made around this table. I felt like we had become a bunch of bickering Italian city-states, you know, sniping at each other. I know that lots of people from this, well, oh, sorry. I know that a lot of people from Duncan go down to Carey Park to curl. So is Carey Park going to retaliate if we have two-tier in the pool here by charging Duncan curlers more? I mean, this could end up being, you know, like sniping back and forth everywhere we go, and that also is punishing families, and that's not good. To me, some version of F, whatever version, seems, you know, proximity and usage. And I'm going to talk about myself just for just 2 seconds here. You will never see me darken the doors of that swimming pool. I hate the swimming pool. But I'm happy for my taxes to go towards the swimming pool because I believe that all communities should have a good swimming pool. Kids like swimming. It's great. I don't have any kids left in the school system. Why should I pay school taxes? Because I believe in a public school system, and I'm happy. Somebody paid it for me, and I got a good education. I'm happy to pay for the school. You will never see me biking out to Kinsall Trestle. If you do, you know I'm on drugs and there's a clown with a knife behind me. But I'm happy that there's a trail out to Kinsall Trestle, and I'm happy we paid for Kinsall Trestle. Same as the zip line at Trails Head Park. Never going to go on it, but I'm glad it's there, and I'm glad to pay towards it.
You're just such a happy person.
I'm a happy person.
Yes. Holy.
So it gives me, except for the clown.
Okay.
It gives me great comfort to think of the CVRD as a big dysfunctional farm family, and it's Saturday morning and we're all out doing jobs. Some of us are getting the boat out of the garage ready to go fishing. Some of us are helping to get the weeds out of the pond, or vacuuming and dusting the living room, or getting lunch ready, or patching the leak in the roof. There's a million things that need to be done around the farm, milking the cows, feeding the chickens. But there are 2 kids in the family, at least 2 of them, that are hiding at the back of the barn going, we don't want to help. We don't want to pitch in. So the political reality of the CVRD is that everybody is a part of this family, whether you like it or not. The province has dictated that CVRD stretches from Shawnigan Mill Lake, the Mill Bay in the south, to North Oyster Diamond in the north. And if you don't want to be what you are, make yourself into a municipality or get adopted by the regional district of Nanaimo. But in the meantime, you're part of this family, and everybody in this family has to pitch in. Nobody gets a free ride. So I hope and pray that at the end of today, that some version of F, and even if it's a staggered version like Director Sebring has suggested, I hope we're able to move forward because this has gone on for far too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for taking some of the tension out of the air. Director Kuhn.
I like simple approaches. And I know quite often you can't go that way because there's inequities involved. My best approach would be by use. I believe firmly if I want to use any facility, or if I want to go and see a movie, if I want to do this, then I will pay. And if I'm not interested in that, then I don't pay. And I know if we looked at the, when we look at the proposal for financing by use, yeah, there would be large shifts in financing. I can see resistance in that. I think what a bunch of us are opposed to is we don't like really the centralization of this whole thing. I don't like it. I like our sub-regional approach that we have in the West. It works very well. For my taste, our taxation is too high, but we wanted that redone rec center, so now we have to pay for it. So it's very logical. I like our setup out there, and I can't see why other areas can't have that among themselves. Like, for instance, the South End, they could easily sort out their inequities down there, or in the North End. I don't see why the whole region would have to change its approach just because some little sub-areas can't solve their or sort out their problems. I think it should be possible. And I really prefer the sub-regional approach to us bundling everything together. If there's no other way, if it has to be all centralized, which I don't really like at all, then at least the youth should come in. There has to be some kind of an adjustment, even if we look at F, let's say, if that's what the majority want to do, I would want to modify it into use, so that at least there's some accountability for people. If you have a lot of people using one facility from another area and that they're hardly paying into it, there has to be an adjustment. And I don't want to pound on any specific area, but for instance, in our arena, I think it was, I seem to remember 44% of the use is from North Cowichan, and we've never protested that, and yet, you know, we are being asked to contribute into another area because we have some use. Well, there's very little use from our end into the center. Very few people go to the pool. Very few people go to the theater or whatever. So use would have to be in there. If we want to really, if that's what the desire of the majority of the people here is to be the whole region, then I think use has to be in there. If we leave use out, everything is just dreamed, and then we're just going into, well, arbitrarily we said this and we said this. No, I think use has to be in there so that there's some accountability as to how many people are using what. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have two more speakers who haven't spoken yet. I want just a short moment, and then I'm going to ask if we want to have a break and do our second round. Okay, so Director Day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for staff and Brian, the consultant, for all your work. There's a lot of good information here, but I'm going to have to say I'm sorry I can't just pick one. I've got a hybrid model in my head. I'm hearing some comments around the table that are leading me to think it might be the way we might want to consider going. I would, and it's called option D here, the proximity one. I would sooner call it the sub-regional approach, where we divide the region into 4 distinct regions: North Cowichan, Duncan, Area D, and Area E being number 1. Number 2 being Area A, B, and C. Number 3 being Ladysmith, G, and H. And number 4 being Lake Cowichan, F, and I. And for those ones where I look across the line here and see where there's some definite huge tax increases implicated in this, well, we leave it up to those areas to figure that out themselves. Let those sub-regions do it. So which in effect that would mean everything would stay status quo in that area, and they would have to iron out those differences between themselves and come to agreements. Now, if that means that the pool area F&I in the town don't pay into the pool, maybe we have to just make an outside agreement as we have and pay a fee per year to avoid a two-tiered system, maybe. I don't know, but I just would like to say, I would like to make a motion to refer this back to staff to bring back a report on the creation of a sub-regional model for recreation in the CVRD with the sub-regions as I've mentioned in my comments earlier. I just think it works so well in Lake Cowichan doing what we do. And it gives a local flavor and local decision-making, and that wouldn't go away, but it just lets us feel like we're in control of how we recreate in that end of the woods, and how we tax our local residents. Because too many decisions can be made here at this core that maybe will affect people at the far ends of a region who really, don't use the facility. So I can't agree with the usage one. So I'm starting to ramble, so I'm going to leave it at that. I prefer the sub-regional model, and I've just made that motion. So if it goes nowhere, I'm okay.
Thank you for that. Director Nicholson. Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't sure you actually wanted to make that motion at this point in time. I would recommend to the board that we not second that motion, and I can turn to you first when we've finished our discussion, just because we haven't. So, but Director Days made the motion. Is there a seconder? No seconder at this time. Director Nicholson.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun going to Regional Recreation Select Committee meetings, and I really appreciate the work of staff and Brian Dawson for, very patient people. And lots of thorough work. I really am comfortable that we have good information from the community, statistically valid information that confirmed the usage stuff that we had from before. I'm not a big fan of usage because it costs quite a bit of money to collect it, and I'm a real fan of recreation, and this is what I heard from the community. Recreation is valued. Recreation is important to our community, and a civil region, a vibrant region, a connected region has recreational facilities, has a great trails and park system, and that's what we have. And I think what we are talking about today is about planning for the future, positioning ourselves to look after what we have and improve upon it into the future. And our region is changing quite rapidly now. It is growing. We've heard that, 2050, there's going to be 35,000 more people here. That's a lot of people for our region to absorb. So we have to be working together. The regional table is about working together regionally. I really appreciate what Director Yanni DiNardo, Director Jackson, and Director Sebring have said, so I don't want to repeat it. But honestly, all our residents, they don't think about all this crazy detail and whatever. We have the people who don't like to pay taxes and pay for services. They are not going to change. They are not going to go away. I know what's best for this region, and that's continuing to support our recreation and working together to plan for the future, to plan a shift, which we've heard is towards outdoor recreation. So we need to have the mechanism and the ability to shift our investments over time. I have to say that I am looking for the option that is the simplest to explain. I like a good, clear storyline, and for me, what we have in front of us, probably the option D, the proximity one, makes the most sense to explain to people. I don't think going down the usage road is helpful. I think we should just invest in recreation. And I guess that's about all I should say.
Thank you. My little bit of input, just remembering back to the 2014-15 when we were looking at the transit function, and we were looking at a formula that was population assessment and number of partners. we looked at it and we said, does that make sense? It was an old formula, I think was very favorable to North Cowichan. When I had to think about it, I could just not argue in favor of it. And what it meant was that North Cowichan ended up paying $166,000 more, and everybody else's portion went down. I thought about it long and hard, and it was to me fair, and we went with 100% assessment. I will say the impact on North Cowichan was nowhere as significant as we were talking about some of the impacts in some of these models here. So I'm not trying to equate the two. It's more about approaching issues with fairness and some degree of responsibility. So, and we implemented it over 4 years, that change, which helped us at North Cowichan. So just as a way to deal with things, that's something, that we did from 2014 on. So my suggestion is that we take a break now. I've still got the list, and we can go to our second round. Okay? Thank you. Hi, I'd like to call our meeting back to order, please. And round two, I wonder where Director Stone is. Is he? Okay. So I will go to Director Acton. Do you remember where you were at?
Yes. Where am I? Here? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at these numbers, it does feel like there is some fairness that's already with the status quo. I don't feel like we need to make a decision just based for the fact of making a decision. A lot of these numbers say to me that, okay, we're on the right track. It's not useless data. It's not useless to have done this exercise. It's very valuable. It shows some discrepancies in area G and H a little bit, and Director Stone has already said that, he's happy to work with those areas. And as far as, perhaps I'm not understanding, I don't see that North Cowichan is being, when they're paying 37% of the funding, and their usage is less than a point below that. I just don't see that there really is a lot to change, and if I think through collaboration, and that's what this board is about. It's not about forcing people into paying certain amounts, that we can actually come together and not waste people's money by having referendums and doing more studies. And I think this is really great information, and we move forward and we look at how things are changing, perhaps in the future of our usage, and I'm happy. I'm happy with status quo. I'm not sure why status quo is such a bad word.
Thank you. Director Stone?
All right. Well, I'll try and sort of pick up a couple things that I'd heard before. And if we can recall, I would say that on a lot of fronts I agreed with Director Sebring. In some cases, we're talking about, in the case of our area in the northern end, sort of degrees of underpayment according to the usage data, not who's paying more or less, it's who's paying less and who's paying less than less. The use today recognizes that the facilities use analysis recognizes that we do, by its nature, recreate in other ways. This is only looking at how we use the facilities. So, you know, as far as the statistics go that led to the tables, that led to the usage data, that's a really strong statistical sample. The statistic accuracy of it can be relied on to inform it. I'm glad to hear that people in a majority around the table recognize that. I'm challenged with finding something that kind of feels like recognizes the usage data, which I have a lot of faith in, but combined with that proximity. And I know that there's options here that say they recognize it, but the vast and dramatic difference between option A, which is looking at the usage, and the options in F, there's a disconnect there that's more extreme than makes sense to me. I would have liked to have sort of broken out those sub-regional groups and then looked at those funding packages based on the usage within each of those areas and tried to come up with a little bit more nuanced formula. But I agree with, I don't disagree with Director Yanni DiNardo, Jackson, or Sebring on that we have to come forward with something. But I'm just not sure in the larger context, we have to recognize the political realities that if we have the majority of the region of the CVRD, the vast majority being characterized as losers, and sorry to use that again, but financial penalty, even though it might be based on some sort of equity, that the political reality is that it will pass. So yes, we can say what is fair, and we should stand up for that, but putting forward something that is destined to fail is not productive either. It's just as ineffective as closing the book on it today and walking away. So I hope we can try and find something that we can see as a compromise between maybe what is completely equitable and what is also palatable. Because if it's not palatable, it's not going to work anyway. And in fact, if you go on a referendum with 3 referendum questions, which all have significant implications in terms of tax burden on people, they could all be destined to fail, and I'd hate to see other important initiatives also fail because we weren't thoughtful enough to bring forward something that's not just equitable, but also palatable.
Thank you. Director Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to put it out there that I'm hoping at some point, I won't do it now, but to be able to move the alternate resolution that I distributed earlier. As I said, I won't do it now. Just a couple of real quick points. You know, so much of this discussion and the discussion of this topic of regional recreation has been triggered by Aquatic Center before it was the Sportsplex. I just want to note that in my area and FIM, the town of Lake Cowichan, we have a lake and we have a river, and people use it. And I think that may be reflected in some of our usage data for the Aquatic Center. But 3.5 years ago, we went to the community, we had a referendum in F&I, and I even had people in the community saying that, you know, I don't agree that we should pay for that, but if the community says in a referendum vote that we should, then we should. And it passed, and we contribute. It's not a lot, but we contribute. In this particular option that's been put forward by our consultant, F&I would not contribute to the Aquatic Center any further. And I feel a little silly about going to the community 3.5 years ago and saying, should we contribute? And then 4 years later coming back and saying, well, guess what? We're just kidding. So a couple other points, and I thank Director Stone for mentioning, you know, I don't think there's any possibility of stacking a referendum question on top of the 2 that we're already pursuing. But also a reminder, phasing something like this, and I'd look to Mr. Barry to correct me if I'm wrong, if we were to pose a bylaw and a referendum question, that we intend to phase in the costs of some of these. I think we have to put in the bylaw the maximum amount. If we wanted to go with a half in 2 years and half in another 2 years, I wouldn't think we would want to go back to public consent for the second 50%. So the full sticker shock is going to be there, and the third or halfway isn't an option. So I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of the fiscal details here. I think that the resolution that I'd like to put is a step forward. It allows for regional and sub-regional thinking, and if the next board thinks that it needs more, then the next board can choose to take on more and to formalize a broader regional question and consult the voters. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Dory.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. One, Director Sebring brought forward the use and the amount of pay in the, and Saltair only uses facilities, indoor facilities, 1.2%. So they shouldn't be paying a lot compared to 35% for North Cowichan, and they have about 35 or 36% of the population. So North Cowichan is using what they probably put forward. People in the community use a lot more where the facility is located. Like the people in Ladysmith use it a lot more than the people of Saltair. And the people on Thetis Island don't hardly use it at all, and yet they're included in this discussion, and they're going to have to pay huge dollars. Okay, as far as a farm boy and my jobs on the farm, I want to do the work, but I want to do the work for and with the people that I have the agreement with. I don't want somebody else telling me how much I'm going to pay to and who I'm going to work for and that sort of thing. So I think we need to go slowly on this, and if an agreement to agree happens at the sub-regional level, well then the CBRD doesn't have to do anything about it. For example, in the Ladysmith, Frank Jameson area, if we come to an agreement there, why should the board gonna impose things on us that we can impose on ourselves and agree to? So I think the sub-regional activity is the best thing, and if we can't agree, then the board should step in, or if we can't agree on the aquatic center, then the people should pay 2-tier, but they should pay for their pool. But if they can't agree, well then they would go to 2-tier. It would be up to them. So that's where my position on the pools are. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And there's no question that most of the electoral areas get a pretty good deal on pools. And there have been several attempts down south to start one, and at risk of opening that can of worms again, I was really surprised when I knocked on doors during the campaign how many people do actually want a pool. It's a lot easier to get a number of people out who are against something to vote it down than to get all the people who are in favor of it to get out and vote, as we all know. But that being said, what is fair for the other thing, like this option F, looking at it, and by my calculations here, the $300,000 extra that Area H would pay would cost the average home $120 a year. The average Area A home would pay $135 a year for its share, and the average Area G home would pay $205 per year. And with the $1.222 million that North Cowichan would save, that would save the average North Cowichan home about $20. per year. So there are degrees of fairness, and I agree with Director Stone that there are a lot of sub-regional deals or certainly things that we could look into and get more equitable deals that way rather than area or option F for sure.
Thank you for that. Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, hearing that we didn't want to get into the fiscal details, well, that's what we're here for. I mean, we don't want to get into it, but we have now gone around again. We requested this again to look at regional recreation. We have studied it to death, and it's time to move on to something. It has been a look at the staff that is, the time we've spent on staff, and we're just going to keep doing that. So every 3 years, we just say we want to study on regional recreation. We need to come to a conclusion. And status quo is not a conclusion to this. And we have spent many, many, many of hours and a lot of money coming up with something again. And so I think that our usage and our data is all clear. And as a regional district, we need to move forward. And however, and the phasing in maybe, you know, or the sub-regional, there has to be something. And I would like to see that we can achieve that today and come together in some consensus and not the status quo.
Thank you. Director Kuhn. You're okay? Okay, I have no more speakers on my list. Director Morrison?
Sure, I'd like to test the House and move my alternate resolution that was distributed earlier.
I'm just going to ask you to read it out so that...
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I thought you assured Director Day that he'd get precedence with the motion that he made that you suggested not be seconded until the discussion was done.
I said that, but Director Morrison put his hand up and he was next.
All right.
If this fails, Director Day will have his opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Number 5 would be Days.
This is a 4-point item. Number 1, that effective immediately, all regional recreation efforts and initiatives to alter current governance and funding models cease. 2, that member municipalities and or electoral areas with acknowledged funding inequities begin to engage in negotiations to resolve them. Number 3, that current governance models remain in place, status quo, except where participants mutually agree to negotiate modifications. And 4, that staff continue to communicate and collaborate on initiatives and opportunities to enhance the delivery of services and recreational experiences for residents and visitors in our region, and I would move that.
Seconded by Director Marcotte. Discussion. Director Jackson.
Well, given that this has been hanging around for 32 years and seeing how excited we all are to begin to engage in negotiations, I don't see that item 2 is going to happen anytime soon, so I'll be voting against this.
Thank you. Director Walker.
Maybe I'm not getting the whole picture, but I just look, when I read the motion and I try to read between the words, it just says to me, we've just selected the status quo option, and almost unanimously, nearly unanimously, this board says that's not the right option. I don't think the public thinks it's the right option. Over many, many years, board after board has dealt with this topic. Board after board has said we need a fair funding formula, and I repeat, a fair one. Board after board thought the present formula was not fair, and that's why we went into 2-tier, and we've done whatever we have over the years trying to patch it up. So this board some time ago said, let's try again. And as I recall, the only remarks I said at that time was, I'm for it because if this board can accomplish and reach a decision on what a fair regional recreational funding formula is, this board would go down in history of accomplishing something, a major issue that board after board has failed to do. And I can remember saying, I would like to be part of this board, and I would like to be here when we come up with a solution. So I'm a little disappointed today that a committee was formed, a committee that did a lot of work using a consultant that's been here before. I never sat in at any of the committee meetings or anything, so I'm coming from behind. I watched board members here volunteer to get on their committee. And sometimes when I watched them volunteering, I have to cynically say I was a little suspicious of some of the reasons of why they volunteered, but I have to say that because that is how I saw it. But anyway, this committee did a lot of work with using a consultant, using staff, had a number of meetings, come up with some options, and I would just hate to see if, with this motion, that is just punting it on to the next board. And I just don't have a good feeling that this board, after 3.5 years, we've accomplished nothing as far as regional recreation. This board has done a lot of good things in a lot of areas. And so I compliment this board on other issues, but I have to give this board and myself a 0 when it comes to dealing with the recreational, regional recreational. A lot of us sit here and say we're thinking regionally, we're doing this, we're doing that, and we think regionally, and we like fairness, but I just don't see any fairness with status quo, and I can't support the motion that just is before us now, because to me that says it's status quo, let everybody, east, west, north, south, talk to each other. I mean, we've been doing that, as Councillor Jackson says, for 32 years or whatever. I don't know how many years, but I've been around this board for a long time, first watching it, then as an alternate, then as a chair, then as a member, and I was hoping this board could come up with a solution. So personally, I'm leaning toward one of the variations. I should say, after sort of knocking myself on this board, I should say where I stand, and I'm leaning toward a variation of F and possibly a 4-year phase-in period. So you can go and say, well, at least we've recommended, and we're going to put to the public an option, and with that option, while it may cost some areas increased money, but we're phasing it in over a number of years so you don't take a hit, a sudden hit and a large hit. It's gently easing into it. We hear you, so we're recommending a phase into one of the options of Area F. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Day.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can agree with a lot of the content in Director Morrison's motion that he's put forward here, but the one that I proposed, I realize there might be some more discussion that would have to be had around that to make it more definitive, but I just feel that Director Morrison's just leaves it too out there. As Director Walker just said, I don't know if those people that are in one of these part of the recommendation, whether they're actually going to get together and do that. under the motion that I propose, I believe that it would give some formal structure to some sort of sub-regional recreation model where people would have to sit down and negotiate between themselves in their sub-regions about who's going to pay for what. And the one thing that I agree with Director Walker on is that a phase-in process should also be negotiated within those sub-regionals as well, because I can't see area G and H just taking a $315 hit or $1,000 hit in 1 year. That's just not fair. So I can't support this motion as it stands because to me it doesn't give enough definition to move us forward. And I also will agree that I don't think this is something we can stack on to our referendum in the general election, because I'd be very afraid of having both fail or all fail, because I think the watershed one is so important that I think it needs to stand alone as a referendum in the upcoming election. So I'll leave it there and see what happens next.
Thank you. Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I will not be in favor of this motion, and I believe it is the status quo, and I think it's time to make up our mind, and we need to be bold. And looking at, we're sort of hashing over what the committee, at the committee level, they've already done. I'd like to hear more from the consultant on what the committee had done on the sub-regional hearing. Director Days has a motion as well, but I'd like to hear about that committee's work on that. And I really believe that we don't need to be set back, and we don't need to throw it in the lap of staff again and say, watch this, watch that. We need to, and usage I don't think is an accurate way as well. We need to come up with a decision and speak for our community as a whole. And I really hope that we could finally work together after what I'm hearing from Director Jackson, that it's been 30 years. Really, we need to make a decision. Don't throw it back again and toss the ball back in there. Let's work together and come up with a solution.
Mr. Johnson, if you could give us a brief synopsis of committee discussions around sub-regional recreation?
Yes, let me try. If I could refer you to, in your agenda package, our report, and page 18 of our report. Page 18 of our report is called Option D, and the title is, What if funding were apportioned on the basis of proximity, open bracket, 4 subregions paying for what is in each of the 4 subregions, close bracket. If one looks at this table, option D, it is, what we've done is we've broken the regional district into 4 areas, kind of the north with Ladysmith, G&H, kind of the west with FI and Lake Cowichan, and then we've got Duncan, D and E, and North Cowichan as central, and then A, B, and C as the south. And so we've got these 4 regions, and in that option, everybody just pays for what's in their subregion. So while it's called the proximity model, we may have also labeled it the sub-regional model. And so just to be clear, in this option, then there are some significant shifts, obviously. The same ones increase, A and C, and the same ones, and G and H, and the same one benefits, North Cowichan. But in any case, in this case also, Ladysmith benefits significantly. But that's the sub-regional option. The committee looked at this option, and they were concerned about a couple of things, in that there are a couple of ice surfaces in the central region, and so maybe people shouldn't pay for 2 ice surfaces when in the north there's none and they're paying for none, but they're using them. So that was a concern about that sub-regional option. And the other concern was that in this case, it would be very difficult to involve the First Nations in the funding because they're so spread out in all of the regions. And so the question was what to do with the 63,000 we're now getting from First Nations for one of the facilities, the pool. So I think that summarizes the discussion around it. The committee asked that debt services be taken out of that option and what impact that would have. And they also wondered about redrawing boundaries, and they were also concerned about what to do with the contribution from First Nations. That discussion actually triggered option F, which took the capital out and then took off. So option F was the sub-regional option, but if people didn't use a facility, they wouldn't pay for it.
Thank you for that. Okay, moving down the list, Director Kuhn.
I'm generally in favor of sub-regional approach. I've always been against centralization, and I'll stick with it. I don't like centralization. It takes away the feeling of individuality, and I just don't like that. I like the group we have out in the West, even though we pay an awful lot of money. I like the way it works. The only other way that I could see possibly adjusting is if Director Morrison's motion fails, and it would be one where the use is blended in. I don't know how it's going to be done. I don't know if there's a possibility of doing it, but that could shift me over, because the use has to be in there. If we totally ignore use, I think inequity has to be in there then. Use has to be accounted for. If you use something, you have to pay for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Stone?
Yeah, option D sounds good. No, I'm just kidding. And I understand the logic makes sense in the report, but the numbers don't seem to follow that logic. The population, the usage between Ladysmith Area G and Area H doesn't support a reduction of 678,000 and an increase of 315 and 300 to areas G and H. So I see the explanation. I just can't for the life of me figure out how that math works on a sub-regional basis. If we're looking at in that option D, based on our discussion, and if I can get a nod or something, I think that included Chemainus in the northern part. No? So that's just areas G, H, and Ladysmith in the northern end? So I know from the statistics that areas G and H combined come nowhere close to 50% of the usage, yet the model here shows a funding shift of almost that much, a total of 715,000 from the town of Ladysmith, a population of 8,500 people, and 358 and 395 from electoral areas G and H. So I'm a stats guy. I still can't see how, if that's the cohorts that we're talking about, how these numbers actually follow that cohort. So if that could be explained to me.
Mr. Johnson or Mr. Elzinga?
Because the population combined with areas G and H, just so I'm clear, they're about 50% of Ladysmith. The assessed value is about 50% of Ladysmith, and the usage is about 20%. So how do we get a more than 50% of the funding coming from those two electoral areas?
Mr. Elzinga?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through to Director Stone, it is based on assessed value, not on usage for that particular model for GH and Ladysmith to participate in the Frank Jameson Community Center.
That makes more sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Director Dory.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The board's decision to revisit regional recreation was, I think, mainly because we had 5 new board members. And they didn't understand. It's a complicated issue, and they didn't completely understand the regional recreation idea. And so we agreed to study it again so that they could get up to speed, and that has been done. So we've achieved a better understanding of regional recreation now than we had before we started this process. So it wasn't a waste of time. And as far as the status quo, I don't think anybody other than one director is really happy with the funding formula. And the status quo we're not talking about here. We're talking about rebalancing the funding in sub-regional areas. So we're not just staying as we were. We're moving ahead. Now, in the north, I think we can come to some sort of an agreement. In the south, I'm pretty optimistic that they will rebalance or look at it anyway. The pool area is always the hanger. And we've got 2 electoral areas that have had issues. One area, they got on every bus, so they have to pay in everything, and they didn't anticipate that there'd be a day when this is becoming too much. And the other one, they voted down a referendum, and the director of the time in the area said that's the worst mistake I ever encouraged, was the people vote against this referendum, because it's just caused all kinds of problems. So that's where the elephant in the room is the pool in the central area. But they can solve it. If they don't solve it, then they can go to 2-tier in that particular area. But it'll require a lot of discussion and work and passing of bylaws. I think a fifth thing that could be added to this proposal by Director Morrison would be to schedule a series of, staff could schedule a series of meetings in those areas to renegotiate the funding formulas, so that we know that we're on track to making the changes that need to be made, that we're not just sitting back and doing nothing, that this would happen in Ladysmith, it happened in the south, the west, and whatever. And if in the west they're completely satisfied with the formula, well, so be it, they don't need to do anything. If in the central area, that's going to take some hard dealing, and I think that they can do it, and they should do it. As far as the sub-regional model goes, it was not very good for Saltaire, because we have Thetis Island in that model, and fair assessment, some big properties on Thetis Island, one person living on it, but they're worth a lot of money, and they would have to pay huge amount of money. You got heritage families over there that have got hundreds of acres of property that are valued in the millions, and they're going to have to pay an assessment on this regional recreation that's going to kill them. So if you have negotiations at the local area, we can talk about those differences amongst each other, and we can get an understanding of the configuration of our zone or our sub-regional area, and we can take that into account. So those are some of the things that should happen. But I really think, to give Director Day and Director Walker comfort in that we're not standing still, we're moving ahead, to have some sort of schedule of meetings for number 5 on his thing, that staff schedule meetings to discuss negotiations of rebalancing funding formulas. So can I add an amendment to that?
You can
Mr.
propose
Chair?
an
I'll propose an amending that staff schedule meetings to discuss negotiations of rebalancing funding formulas.
Seconded by Director Acton. On the amendment, Director Jackson.
I don't know how many times we've heard in the last little while that staff is right to the edge of their capability of doing the work that's already on their plate, and we have talked about removing stuff off the table, and here we are referring a whole new set of jobs and tasks to staff who can barely do what's on the table at the moment. I think it's a really poor idea.
Okay, thank you. Director Yanni DiNardo.
Yeah, I think that's once again, we're not doing our due diligence and making a decision. We're passing the buck. We're here we go again, and just not coming up with the proper making a decision, and we need to do that. And we have been told, we know that over and over again in every department in CVRD can hardly get the work done. It's so overwhelming that there's so much coming at everyone here that this needs to be, this is something that we are at the point to make a decision. We have to make that decision and not status quo and sending more work back. Make a decision.
Okay, I'd like to call the question on the amendment. All those in favor? And opposed? So the motion. Oh, we need the names. Director Nicholson, Day, Yanni DiNardo, Walker, Stone, Jackson, Sebring, Lefebvre. Okay, that motion, the amendment, that was the amendment. So back to the original motion. Are we ready to vote on the original motion? Oh, Director Morrison? Sorry, Mr. Alzinga? Excuse me, Director Morrison, just for a second.
If I may, Mr. Chair, and thank you, and staff do have some questions for Director Morrison on this motion. I think it's probably appropriate before the vote, and so these are directed to Director Morrison for some clarification. In number 1, that effective immediately all regional recreation efforts and initiatives to alter current governance and funding models cease. So a clarification question. The current governance and funding models is part of phase 3 of the regional recreation study. So I'm assuming that phase 4 would still go ahead, which is the regional recreation master plan.
I guess it would be up to the will of the committee.
Yeah,
Okay.
I assumed when I read that it meant no phase 4.
Okay, thank you. And then on number 2, that member municipalities in electoral areas with acknowledged funding inequities begin to engage. I'd be looking for some direction for staff involvement, as well as which are the acknowledged funding inequities.
Yeah, and I would argue we can't actually tell member municipalities to begin to engage in negotiations. I don't think we can really do that. We might suggest to them.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Director Morrison, you have the floor.
Thank you. You know, I'm not as invested in this resolution as some might think, but I'm really finding it, and sadly, a little rich, that those that attended the meetings, put in the effort, you know, showed up, studied, and have indicated that there's no clear path forward, are, in a sense, being disregarded by, we have to make a decision. It was pretty darn clear from coming out of that committee work that this board is not ready to make a decision. So I'm suggesting that if there's going to be more research, yeah, we can just have a regular committee for regional recreation. But if part of what my resolution was about was those that I believe have acknowledged at the committee when the work was being done, areas G, areas H, I think A, B, and C, possibly D might look at the Shawnigan Community Center, that they might look at some of those issues and have some voluntary negotiation. Defeat the motion if you want to defeat the motion. But I'm really reluctant to say we have to make a decision today when the committee wasn't prepared to move forward. And I'd be really reluctant to look at a resolution that's going to force people at this table and their communities into a situation where they are forced to pay more. And they really won't have much of a choice, because we know how referendums are, how the results of referendums go. The population centers rule the day. So my resolution that's before us today that we're debating isn't forcing any jurisdiction to engage in anything that they don't want to.
Just one little word of caution, the fact that at the committee level there was not a clear consensus does not mean that the board is not prepared to, or in a good position to make a decision. Director Nicholson.
Yeah, I just find Director Morrison's comments less than helpful at this point. I am very committed to moving forward. I think we need some leadership at this point. I am not a political politician, but honestly, the status quo is not okay. And what we did through all this analysis is understand that nothing that we can choose is going to be perfect, but let's choose the most practical, most easy to communicate and reasonable solution and move forward, because we need to do a regional master plan. We need to keep talking together and planning for the future. This is not about the past anymore.
Thank you. Director Stone.
Yeah, and I thank you for bringing it up. I don't think that anybody at that table didn't see a path forward. It's just we couldn't agree on what the path was. So I just want to say, and it's not an indictment of the committee or the previous directors, but when we do hear that this is a conversation that's happened multiple times over 30 years, to sort of hang the burden of it on the committee and say they didn't do good work, I think is unfair characterization, or else then we could really damn the directors who have been on previous boards that have previously visited this. The committee, I think, did good work. We just couldn't agree on what we thought was the best way forward. And I just have to say that I think the best way forward, if we were to start over again and be truly regional, that we would base everything purely on assessment. I think that when North Cowichan talked about that around transit, that was a wise thing. It talks about the values of the properties that are paying in. It becomes truly regional. Everyone's got skin in the game, and everyone should have a say. And then the people at the board have a dollar for dollar representation of what gets paid into them. I know that's not palatable, and I think that that's where I'm trying to come from. Is we have to be strategic about what is also possible. If we put something forward to a referendum that is destined to fail, then we haven't done good work. So I'm willing to adjourn this meeting sometime today and come back to it again and again and again until we come up with something. And through the discussion and explanation, I'll be honest with you, I'm understanding where the staff and the consultant came up with options F. Because when you look at what's the closest option that reflects use and that desire for a sub-regional approach, maybe that does reflect it better. You know, I caution us, though, to understand that, you know, I just counted up and the net tax increases versus tax reductions in terms of areas. And if we went to region-wide referendum, the fact is that the municipalities could carry the day. And in these models, all the municipalities do pay less. I think that's understood, that generally speaking, municipalities invest more in sort of built infrastructure, and that has an impact on how we pay for it. But it doesn't recognize that over the years we accepted that responsibility to pay for it. You know, I'm just becoming more confused on a way forward that doesn't you know, sort of really put an extreme burden on some groups while giving significant windfalls to others. But at this point, when I look at the usage and then reflect on what other options may reflect that best, one of the compromise options on F may be the best way forward. If the board decides that they need to make a move and do something, again, I just have to go back to what I feel will be the reality on the ground. If you're in your area and you feel like you're going to have to get hit with a big tax penalty, you're going to vote against it because, you know, if you can have your cake and not have to pay for it, why would you? But yet then the municipalities could be big beneficiaries and our voters would all support it. And then unfortunately the electoral areas will be, you know, sort of victims, if you will. So I just wish I could find a compromise path forward. And, you know, option D, I understand that it's the assessment based on a sub-regional thing. You know, maybe in my mind that makes sense, but then the numbers in reality are just so so extreme that I'm not sure how that works either. So I'm willing to sit here at the pleasure of the board and keep trying to work through it. But let's not sort of chastise each other for the work that we've done. I think that when I listen to the committee work, I didn't disagree with any of the things. We just weren't able to come up with an option that we all felt we could support. And I'm sorry that we put this on the board, but I don't think that's a failing of this committee, because if it is, then it's even more of an indictment of the previous directors that went around this issue over the last 30 years.
Thank you. I've got Director Sebring and then Director Kuhn, and I still have a list after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the fact that you issued that gentle clarification about the board not being ready to make a decision. The committee, as Director Stone just said, was not able to come to consensus. That doesn't mean this board is not ready or should not be ready to make a decision. I think that's the responsibility of this table. Just back to debate on the resolution that's before us. My biggest concern, and I want to put this gently, but in point 2, that member municipalities and/or electoral areas with acknowledged funding inequities. Who's going to acknowledge the funding inequities? It's unspecified in here, and if I was a region with funding inequities as identified in the report, I wouldn't go necessarily voluntarily to a municipality and say, I'm not paying enough, because, you know, that's kind of the core of that's the elephant in the room here. That's why we can't come to an understanding and an agreement. So just that wording in itself is enough to make me say no to this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Kuhn?
Yes, we've had an awful lot of discussions now, but what I'd like to do, though, is bring us back to why was this whole thing actually started? I didn't detect an awful lot of, let's say, discontent or upset or whatever within all of the directors of the munis.
Can I interrupt you just for a second? We do have a motion on the floor. I know we've been here quite a few hours. If we're going to go back to the beginning, and it's really, you know, if you can contain your remarks to the motion.
I'll do it very quickly, yeah. Okay, so what surprises me is there wasn't a real desire by the majority of us to actually go ahead with this. It started because of a failed referendum or AAP in one area. So now we're sitting here, we're banging our heads about something that I didn't think was a big problem to start with. Yes, there are some inequities in some areas, but now to try to redo everything that we tried, what was it, 8 years ago, and I was part of that, and we ended up in the same situation that we are at now. We couldn't find an equitable way to finance. So I don't know. I would much rather stick with the status quo, or else, if need be, let's have more discussions. But to push something forward now that doesn't seem to be even near perfect doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to ask for the board's indulgence to try and be concise, and if you have something new to add, just add something new. Director Dory. I'm sorry, Yoni DiNardo, then Dory.
I'll pass because I'm waiting. I have more to discuss, but.
Thank you, Director Dory.
Yes. If this motion fails, it'll rob us of the opportunity in our local areas to discuss and come up with a solution. It stops there. It probably won't stop me, because I'll go to Ladysmith and I'll say, this is an inequity, and we will come to some sort of solution to fix it. But to rob everybody of that opportunity, it just isn't right. North Cowichan and the people that contribute to the pool are the main people that want to vote against this. But North Cowichan has 35% of the population, and they pay 35% of the or 36% of the cost. So it's not as big a deal as the things. So I acknowledge there's an inequity, other people do, want to fix it, and they'll move on. So that's, we just can't defeat this.
Just to be absolutely clear, if this motion fails, that will in no way prevent those negotiations or discussions from happening. In fact, they're going to happen around the funding of the pool because certain agreements are running out. So failure of this motion will not prevent discussions from happening between entities.
It might encourage movement.
Director Marcotte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've sat at this board for more than 20 years, and every last one of them, this was a topic on them. We keep doing the same thing over and over again, and we're not getting a good result or a bad result. We're just giving up most of the time because it is very difficult. So I have a lot of concerns with what we are doing. Once again, we're wasting a lot of time and effort on something that we left on our own. I think we could get together and do the sub-regional partnerships and go from there where we still have some autonomy for our own constituents. I think for me as well, one thing we have to do is get better regulations for our own electoral area community charter so that we can have some stronger basis when we make our discussions and decisions on things. So I'm certainly not, I'm not happy with what's been brought forward today.
Thank you. Director Jackson and then Director Yanni Denard.
Thank you very much. This has been status quo, and I'm not happy with it, and nor has anybody been happy with it for the last 32 years. I wouldn't even vote on assessment, even though that's supposedly the fair way, but you look back, say, 30 years ago, somebody bought a piece of farmland for probably $25,000, and to their shock and horror, it's now worth $5 million. I don't want to punish, families like that. What I want is some balance here. And again, looking at areas G and H, in every single case, they're not pulling their weight. Even in based on use, they're not pulling their weight. So so there's got to be a way. And if we just recently received the economic development plan for the CVRD, and we want to make this area a tech center. We want to invite young families and professional families, and as Director Yanni Denaro said, it's going to be 35,000 more people here in the blink of an eye. We've got to make this area welcoming, and it's got to have the services, and everybody has to pitch in. And I'm hoping that today, whether we pick option F to start working forward, the 1/3 of the way, something, but we cannot stay where we are, or successive boards are going to be back here again, secretly cursing us.
Thank you. Director Yanni DiNardo, you have a short.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be brief. Some areas did get on every bus. We acknowledge that. Some areas did not get on any of the buses. That's where the gap comes from here. And we need to be leaders, and we are not chastising the committee that has done this work. We're acknowledging this committee and acknowledging once again what's gone on again. And we are acknowledging the good work of the committee. And now we need the good work of leadership at this board.
Thank you. I do have Director Day, and then I would like to call the question, and then I have a suggestion after that. Director Day.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would also have a suggestion, and that would be that the Regional Recreation Select Committee, if this motion does fail, be sent back to their room with option D and option F shortlisted, and that they come back and report back to the committee as a whole. I'm not putting any time constraints on this at all. I don't think it has to be done tomorrow or by the end of this year, but it could be possibly a recommended thing for the next board's strategic priority, because it's not even on our list and we're spending an awful lot of time on it. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to call the question on the motion, which you have before you on paper. All those in favor and opposed? Motion is defeated. If you could keep your hand up, Director Nicholson, Day, Yanni DiNardo, Walker, Stone, Jackson, Sebring, Lefebvre. Sorry, did I go too fast for you? Okay. My recommendation at this point, appreciate what Director Day said, but it is lunchtime. We would like to huddle and see if we can come up with some advice for the board in the interim to see if we can help. If that's acceptable to you, then we can go for lunch. And Director Day, full recognition that you can have a guarantee at this time, the first shot at when we come back. I know. What, 25 minutes? Half an hour? I'm assuming it's here. Yeah, half an hour. 12:30? Do it. I'd like to call our meeting back to order, please. And we had a chance, Mr. Crothers, Mr. Elzinga, and I had a chance to talk during the break. And I believe we have something to suggest, and it ties in somewhat with what Director Day was talking about. I don't expect this will make everyone happy. Maybe it won't make everyone angry, though, so we just have a suggestion based on what we've heard around the table, and everybody has been very straightforward with their views on this. And what we discussed was considering a sub-regional model in which there was an association or a commission for each sub-region that would be in a position to negotiate outstanding issues that have been identified in all the work that has been done between those associations. And I'm going to ask Mr. Crothers just to speak to his experience and his point of view on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what we've heard around the table, there was a fairly consistent discussion around the benefits of a sub-regional model. That would be basically option D that was presented. Just by a bit of background, and I conferred with Mr. Johnson during the last session, I'm not aware of any regional district in this province that has a true sub-regional recreation model.
Regional, you said sub-regional.
Or sorry, regional recreation model. Many have tried. I know many have tried, and for reasons similar to what you're experiencing here today, they've not failed. I've also had experience in my other locations as a CAO with the sub-regional models and the success of those sub-regional models in terms of local governing bodies like you have now. You've got good examples here in the CVRD with the Island Savings Commission, and you've got the commission out west with F&I and the town of Lake Cowichan. It's not a finite solution to the issue you're dealing with. It's a process to deal with the issue you're dealing with. You have other issues in your areas that are over and above recreation that would warrant some conversations with your electoral area or your municipal partners that are in that geographic area. I know I had floated a concept, and I don't know that I sent it to the whole board. I may have just sent it to the electoral area directors about 6 months ago with regard to this kind of a process where you would have four distinct sub-regional committees that would be sanctioned by the board and sanctioned by bylaw, so that you would have rules of engagement, and there would be a process for how those committees undertook their work and how they reported back to the board and how decisions were made. I think the work that the committee has done and the work that Mr. Johnson and Elzinga have presented just highlights the benefit of that kind of a model potentially. You have, and this exercise has indicated that there are some pinch points. There are a couple of areas within the regional district that are problematic. This potential model would allow those sub-regional entities to negotiate amongst themselves to resolve those potential problems. It may not result in absolute equity, because you may have one sub-region who's not willing to come to the table and resolve the problem to the satisfaction of the other party. But I think at the very least, it takes it away from this board table and it puts it back in the communities, so that those individual directors and those individual communities can speak amongst themselves and come up with equitable solutions amongst themselves. I've not been involved in this process as a CAO. I've allowed staff and allowed the process to unfold, and it was very interesting to hear the discussions this morning. And I'm, as your CAO, I'm always looking for the commonalities. I'm looking for where can we find a win here amongst all of you that would satisfy your needs. And that's what I heard this morning, is that I got the sense that there's some desire to look at a sub-regional model. I practically would suggest it would be difficult, I think, for you all to come up with a single regional model that you could reasonably articulate in the community, that you would get the buy-in from everyone. It comes back to the issue of stating the problem. You know, all of our issues that we've been dealing with, we've been focused on solving a problem. And so you would have to articulately, you know, convey what the problem is across the entire region. And it's clear from the material that's come out is that this isn't a comprehensive regional issue. They're pinch points within the region at a sub-regional level. So again, it's a process for moving forward. I would recommend that if, you know, to the new board, if this board was interested in doing the legwork, that this be something that this board would explore for the new term of the board, in establishing that kind of a structure where it would allow the sub-regions to get together in a much more formal arrangement to be able to discuss issues of shared services and issues that are of interest. They may not even be shared services, that they may be unique issues within a sub-region that those elected officials want to come together and discuss and bring recommendations back to the board from an advocacy point of view, or from maybe establishing a new service. But I think this board would find some real benefits, and my experience with this model has been very positive in other areas of the province.
Thank you, Mr. Crothers. Mr. Elzinga, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we did have some discussion on process and long-term vision. We would still actually have to address some of our immediate pinch points and how we move forward with that. But yeah, we were certainly having that discussion around subregions.
Thank you. Okay, back to the board. Director Sebring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm intrigued by what I'm hearing from the CAO. I just need a bit of clarification on a couple of concrete examples.
I mean, it's all well and good for us to say, you know, the south end should sort out the Shawnigan Community Center, and the west end can sort out their arena, and up in Ladysmith, they can sort some things out. But what do we do with facilities that that clearly, according to the usage reports, have wide usage from a whole whack of subregions? I'm thinking the Sportsplex and I'm thinking the Aquatic Center. How is that pinch point addressed in this model? And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, I'm just wondering what that would look like.
Obviously, it's early days, but if those entities reside in the central jurisdiction, then the central jurisdiction would be negotiating with the south jurisdiction or the west or the north jurisdiction, commission or committee.
But I mean, that would become a very big sub-region for the Sportsplex, because a lot of people partake in that. So, you know, maybe I'm getting hung up on the terminology of sub-region. I don't know.
But I think that was our thinking, that we could not avoid facing some, just creating the 4 separate sub-regions does not answer all the questions. And we've actually faced that before. Unfortunately, with the pool in a way that was not fun or good for anyone in terms of 2-tier registration. And we would hope that these commissions could come to an agreement on cost sharing on some significant items that did not just fit within their own sub-region.
I'm sorry, but are we talking about the establishment of new commissions for these sub-regions?
So for commissions, as Mr. Carruthers described it, a commission for a sub-region that represented the recreational facilities in that region.
Maybe I wasn't hearing him right. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can further clarify, it wouldn't necessarily need to be a commission. They can be a committee of this, they'll be subcommittees of this board, potentially. There's some structural decisions to be made about how you want to organize it, but they have, in some jurisdictions, are established by bylaw. And so that they're not a will of the chair. They become a governance model for the regional district, and they establish the terms of reference. They establish the participation. They establish the voting rules, how that reporting will come back to the board, that sort of thing. They are quite formal, but what they do allow is for the individual areas to come together in a more formal way to talk amongst each other on issues that relate to one another. Your comment earlier about what to do with those distinctly regional facilities, the option is to pull those out and to deal with them separately as individual issues. That is an option, and you'll continue to, as a regional board, you know, struggle with those. Or the other option is to try and have negotiations and discussions as sub-regions around those issues and attempt to come to some resolution.
We tried to pull the Sportsplex out and deal with it last time, and that didn't end well. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Director Stone. Then Director Yanni DiNardo.
Well, I like the sound. We had some conversation. Why didn't I support the resolution? I said because I felt like it needed to be done at this board table by bylaw. It shouldn't be optional. So I think that addresses some things. I think there's significantly regional facilities that we need to address, like Director Sebring just said. But if we're able to come up with sub-regional sort of pods and give those voices that are participants in each of those functions, voting authority. Right now, our Parks and Rec has a spot for G&H on it, but they're just making recommendations to our council. So it doesn't give them the true voice that they should have at this board. So if we have a commission that has some powers to make recommendations to this board, to make regional decisions based on that sub-regional consideration, I'm fully in support of that kind of model. I'd be interested to see how a model might work, and I know that means maybe punting it down the road in some sense, but the other alternatives we've talked about today that have been moved on the floor don't get us closer. I think what you're suggesting would actually get us closer to a longer-term tenable solution. I think in the sub-region of the north, I think we have to work also with North Cowichan though, which might complicate things for North Cowichan, but Fore Lake is a sub-regionally significant. It's our hockey arena for our kids. There's only a couple of our kids that make it to the big show here in Duncan. So most of our families for skating or for
Hockey do use the Floor Lake Arena. And conversely, Chemainus, a lot of Chemainus residents use our pool and participate in our community. So if we can build around that, I think that that's a great place to start.
Thank you, and I had imagined that there would be a negotiation there to just fairly deal with that situation. Director Yanni DiNardo.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was the Phase 4 of the master plan. Where does that go? Excuse me.
I would suggest that's probably a separate question. Mr. Elzinga, did you want to speak to your thoughts around answering that question?
I will try, Mr. Chair, and I would probably invite Mr. Johnson up to provide some comments as well around that, because he's been our partner, obviously, as we've worked our way through the process. So the committee broke the work into 4 phases. So obviously the facility use phase is informing this phase 3 around structure and governance. We've done half of the master plan already with the public engagement phase. So I've heard some discussion today around outdoor recreation and some of the movement in that regard, and a lot of that would be addressed through phase 4. So I think there is some possibility to move forward with at least some of the phase 4 work informed by the public engagement. There would definitely be some questions around governance. So the Phase 4 master plan really speaks to the detail of action items that would be addressed in the future. So long-winded way of saying, yes, it is possible to move forward with some of Phase 4. I'm not sure if the complete Phase 4 will be done until this stage, until the governance is completed. And can I?
Thank you for that.
Mr. Johnson says we're good with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Any other thoughts around the table? Director Day.
Thanks for throwing me on the spot after that. If Mr. Crothers put his suggestion into a motion, I would definitely support that 100%. The only question that's arose, 1 or 2 have been answered at the podium just a moment ago, but what happens to the Regional Recreation Select Committee? Does it just sit in limbo now, or does it get dissolved?
Our suggestion would be that it be dissolved, that the discussion has moved to the board level. I believe, Mr. Crothers, I mean, I think that's where we're at. So, who did I just see? Director Morrison, and then Director Jackson.
Thank you. I guess this would be through to Mr. Crothers. When you were discussing some of the options that were discussed during the break around governance and recreation, and I think there was that possibility of perhaps shared service. And I think I was a recipient of the email that was sent out a few months ago, and so that just sent me way off in a different direction around the legislative questions around authorities and, you know, the structure. And I think I've got some questions about that basis, because there's going to be, obviously, if we were looking at the south, you've got the cooperation of 3 or perhaps 4 electoral areas that are all local government act regulated, whereas in the west, under our structure here, we've got our commission, but we've got municipal and electoral, and same would be in the north if some of those services would be shared. So I guess I'd look to you or to Mr. Barry as to, could we get some insight and some comments as to how that might work from a legislative perspective? Not today, but
Yeah.
As we move forward.
So I'll start, and Mr. Barry can fill in anything that I might miss. Every one of those committees is different because the work you do is based on the services that you share. And so what the Services Committee structure does is it allows the participants of those services to come together to make recommendations back to the board. In some cases, that bylaw can actually delegate authority to that services committee to make operational decisions very similar to what you have with your commissions now. Your commissions actually have authority to do some on-the-ground decision-making with respect to the operation of the facility. So that is all would have to be resolved, and that would all have to be included in the framework. The real value of this kind of a model is I see the Island Savings Commission coming together. The elected leaders of the participants of that service come together. I see the same thing happening in Lake Cowichan, albeit there's members of the public on that commission. But your conversations are confined to the recreation facility. Your conversations don't extend to other issues or other shared services. You always end up bringing those back to this bigger table. And this kind of a structure allows you to have those kinds of conversations of other issues. You know, Area H and G and Ladysmith may want to talk about derelict vessels. They may want to talk about some park acquisition issues in their area. They might, so there's all kinds of localized issues that you don't have a forum right now to talk about unless you informally get together at a coffee shop or you happen to have a sidebar conversation at a board meeting. And there's transparency because these committees become public. And so people can come to the services committee meetings as public and see those deliberations and see those conversations. It also allows you to further issues that aren't even associated with a service. You may have a particular, well, the derelict vessels is an example. So it would take some time to put the framework together, but there's examples out there of existing frameworks, and from my experience, they work, and they work very well.
Thank you. Director Jackson?
I'm not exactly sure of the wording that Mr. Carruthers said, but whatever it was he said, I move it.
So I think the motion we would be looking for would, oh, Mr. Carruthers has been working on it.
Mr. Barry can fine-tune this piece, sees fit. The recommendation would be that a framework for a sub-regional services committee structure be prepared for consideration by the board.
Okay, so I have Director Yanni DiNardo, then Director Sebring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're talking about a framework, and I understand that our CAO, so Mr. Carruthers, has some experience. Could you give us was it the Kootenay Regional District has a sub-regional model? Mm-hmm. Can you share some of that, so get an understanding? And then I have a follow-up, if that's okay.
So the Central Kootenay Regional District established a bylaw that enabled the establishment of these committees. And it was interesting, in the Central Kootenay, there was, I believe, 6 sub-regions. And not all sub-regions were willing to participate. So the bylaw was enabling. For those areas that wanted to participate, they did. And for those that didn't or weren't quite ready, they didn't. And that was all included in the bylaw. But the bylaw basically laid out the structure, laid out the delegation authority from the board to these committees. It discussed procedurally how meetings would take place, who would chair them, that sort of thing. So, like I said, there's a bit of work that goes into it because all of your areas are different, and you have different makeups of your committees in terms of electoral areas and municipalities. But it basically provides you a framework formally to sit down as elected leaders of a defined geographic area and have discussions and make recommendations back to the board on particularly on shared services, because ultimately that's what you're dealing with, but also allows dialogue and discussion around other things that are outside the services that you share.
Thank you. Thank you. I just have the follow-up, and where does this leave Area D that's the complicated? Area D has been, it has been an issue that's so many years, it's been an issue with all of this. Where does that leave Area D now?
Yeah, through the chair. So I've looked at that, and that is the one complicating factor for this structure, and it could possibly be that Area D would sit on 2, given that you actually kind of straddle 2 sub-regions in the regional district. But that's something I think we just have to sit down and talk about and look at what made sense for Area D, whether it was more logical to be part of the core or to sit on both. And it's really around where your shared services are. You have existing service establishment bylaws that have you participating with multiple parties. And so you may have, the director may have to be at both tables potentially, depending on the issues.
Okay, I've got a list. Director Sebring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The more I hear about this model, the more I like it. I guess part of my question goes to process, and it's a question to the CAO. Without trying to sound like I want to rush you, how quickly can we get this done in the sense that can this board collectively say, okay, this is the direction we want to go, and we're going to have this established by the end of October so that the new incoming board doesn't have to get totally re-educated and get all the history. It's just, there it is, it's done. This is now the process, and the new board chair appoints those regional framework.
I think in terms of staff, I've got examples of it. So it's a matter of taking a template, an existing template, and modifying it for the purposes of the CBRD. I think the heavy lifting would be around this table and around the various groups of directors that would want to sit down and talk about how that might look. Probably involve a couple of workshops, but the actual bylaw itself and the terms of reference, that's all developed, and it's just a matter of taking it and adapting it to our situation here. And you know, if this board was interested in having something like that looked at prior to the election, this is a significant piece of work, but I think it's an important piece of work, and I would suggest that we would make it a priority to work through that process.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got Directors Acton, Day, and Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, I think it's a safe assumption, but I'm assuming it's similar to what we have been kind of talking about after electoral area services. Often we'll talk about in a sub-regional for the South. And then in this case, it would just bring it to a board level and have the legislation behind us so that we're doing it formally and cooperatively. And I think in the South, we've been searching for a way to work collaboratively, and we understand each other, and we cross over in many different things. So this sounds exciting. Thank you.
Good. Director Day, you're okay? Director Stone.
So just a couple questions. So like for an electoral area like Cowichan Bay, then if they're going to be kind of sitting on two areas, you're going to have to be some, if we're looking at funding through that lens, they're going to have to be some, you know, sort of not paying the full, you know, sort of both directions, right? Because I mean, almost they'd be getting double taxed, you know what I mean? They'd be participating in too much.
Right.
So that would obviously be looked at. What about the Islands Trust area? Like they should be excluded. So can we establish a service area that would exclude Islands Trust areas, or like I know that on water they're not in on that service, right?
Let's not try and answer that
Okay,
today.
so-
Let's raise that as a question and.
Okay, and then the last one would be that sort of northern end of the North Cowichan, right? Because Chemainus kind of does the same as Area D, kind of some stuff in the south and some
Yeah.
stuff in the north.
Thank you, and the concern around Area D, fully understand that. I suspect we're gonna have to have these agreements between sub-regional areas, so, you know, if Area D was only in one of the two, there might be, you know, part of the agreement with the other sub-region that covered participation in some service.
Okay.
So it might be possible to do it so that there was only were ever in one sub-region, but you still had commitments.
Yeah, absolutely. I just
Like-
wanted to say this is, you know, frankly, what I said when we first started that I seem to get chastised for. But just wanted to be aware that those Islands Trust areas, Area D, and then the northern end of North Cowichan are.
Yeah. So that's the last person I have on the list. Oh, sorry, Director Davis, then Director Morrison, then Director Nicholson.
Thank you. The way I understood it, it was more of a governance committee, not funding committee, because when I look at the map, Area E could be in 3 of them, the west, south, and the central. So it seemed, is that what you're proposing?
So depending on the participants of a service, there may be situations where a director from another area may go and sit. If there's a topic of discussion that relates to that shared service where there's 4 or 5 participants in the south, and I don't know for sure what that might look like. But yeah, there has to be some flexibility, that it's focused primarily on the participants of the service. And you have some logical groupings of that here in the regional district. So you deal with those common ones, and then there will be a few outliers that we'll have to adapt to deal with. But it's very much a governance table. It doesn't include the public. It is the elected officials for the participants. So that's something that the board would want to consider, because right now you have different commissions. You have some that are made up solely of elected officials. You have some that are made up with members of the public. And so that's something that each area was going to want to grapple with. But primarily it is the elected officials for those participating areas initially. I'll also be honest, it takes up a little bit more time. It means some regular meetings. Each one of the 4 sub-areas would probably be meeting maybe monthly, maybe every couple of months, depending on the types of issues that you're dealing with. With that comes support. You're going to need legislative support in terms of a recording secretary and all of that kind of thing. So it comes with implications, but I would hope that those implications would far outweigh the benefits would far outweigh those implications of the time. What I have found my experience with these committees is that it takes a lot of the on-the-ground debate away from the board table. It puts it back in the communities where the elected officials are working together. And then the recommendations come back to the board, and they're generally agreed to because the work has been done, the heavy lifting has been done at the committee level. And then the board has a fair bit of confidence that what's coming forward. And I think, as somebody mentioned earlier, if the committee can't come to an agreement, that's why the board is here. The board is here to make those decisions on behalf of that committee if they're not in agreement.
Thank you. Director Morrison.
Thank you. This is a very interesting concept. I guess the one issue and one thought I'm having is that we began today with regional recreation and models and maps and numbers, and this is a significant diversion from that, though it may be contributing to where we're ultimately going. I think what I'd like to see, since this is a fair departure, is before we get too far into the process and having the whole concept developed, could you give us in the weeks ahead, a quick overview of this in writing so that we're all considering it eyes wide open with all the information that's available for us to consider, just to even further endorse the concept once we have a better idea, because it's kind of a new business item, really, when you consider the nature of the meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Acton? No? Okay. That's good. Director Walker? I'm sorry, it was Director Nicholson. No? Yeah, Director Nicholson. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I've got some questions. When I think about this, I think we're formalizing the status quo, which might not be a bad thing. I'm not necessarily saying that this, but I'm trying to figure out how this really addresses the regional recreation question. And so I'm still not clear how this model would deal with the sportsplex and the theater and the pool. And from a timeline perspective, I think I've got a pool issue that I've got to deal with in a timely way. And I'm wondering what other services that we share that would be part of this that are sub-regional. So can you remind me of those that would also be addressed by this group?
Mr. Crothers?
Through the chair. So Director Nicholson's correct. This isn't necessarily a solution. What I would suggest is that there probably is an opportunity to have some discussions with the municipality of North Cowichan and Duncan and Area E with regard to the existing issue that we have around funding for the aquatic center as an interim measure. In terms of what services, I don't have those in front of me. I just know anecdotally, particularly in the south, that there are a number of services that the 3 area and in some cases 4 are actually sharing. You have park services that our individual electoral areas are dealing with, but could take a more sub-regional approach to some of their decisions around their parks. So that would be part of my report, as I would come back with an analysis of which services are shared by which parties, so you can see the topics of discussion that you would be having around the table, and also the other potential issues that you may wish to, as a subcommittee, discuss in your particular area.
Right, so I think we should be clear about this, that we are looking for some way to move forward on the regional recreation front today, and this may or may not do that. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be looking at this, and I think that's a good thing to do, but I am not convinced it's going to help us work more regionally on recreation. I think it may in fact entrench us more in a sub-regional model. And I think that's a little bit problematic, because when I think about the parks and trails, and Director Davis raised the issue of the lack of kind of logic behind how that has grown and developed from a regional perspective, I'm not sure that then we would end up dealing with that sub-regionally, whether that would in fact address that need to think in a bigger picture way. But I'm willing to give it a try, I guess. I really have reservations.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Director Walker.
Doctor, give me the news.
Settle down, folks.
That's it?
Yeah, I haven't had many minutes to think about this, but more and more it strikes me as status quo. Another director said that. We're doing a lot of this now. Somehow I thought it would be more comfortable if I heard in that motion that today we approve this concept in principle, and I would be more comfortable, and I hate to ask staff for another report, but I would be more comfortable if we approve this in principle with a report to sort of flesh out the details a little further. I don't know how many more hours we can be sitting here, and I don't think us should suddenly resolve into committee and work out these details. I think we should leave it to staff or one or two people, or
can I read the
committee or something, but get some more details and bring it back to the report for final approval. I just feel a little
Can I read the recommendation again, as just only slightly altered by Mr. Berry, that a framework for a sub-regional services committee structure be prepared for consideration by the board. So that is the motion. Just to have something to look at. It's.
You got it.
Okay.
I'm more comfortable now.
Thank you, Director.
Because I think it's status quo, with a report coming back, and we have another boo at it. We haven't solved the problem today. Thank you, Director Stone.
So is the intention that we would not be addressing the funding issues within that sub-regional structure? Because if it is, we're just putting that committees together and not solving the crux of the issue, right? So with that report, I feel like there should be a proposal on how a sub-regional funding formula around the recreation pieces would work. To me, that's the entire thrust. So if that's not included, then I don't see, I appreciate that staff will come back with a report, but if we're not within that report looking at the structure of these sub-regional committees addressing the funding inequities, then I don't understand.
That's my understanding of one of their prime responsibilities.
So we would have that as part of that report. Okay, thank you.
Director Day.
Yes, just in response maybe to some of Director Nicholson's concerns, and the other people around the room I heard mention this. The Regional Recreation Select Committee did not come to us with recommendations today. We're simply talking about a whole list of consultant recommendations. So I'm comfortable moving forward with this direction, and I'm just sitting here thinking, I didn't expect this to happen today, but to me it's a huge victory and a great way forward for all these situations in the future where we, like as Mr. Carruthers said, where we can get the heavy lifting done in our own corners of the region and bring it back to this table. And I think we'll get much more consensus on good decisions in the future if we can move forward with this. So, thank you.
Thank you. Director Jackson.
I completely concur with Director Day. I don't see this as holding the status quo in any way. All morning, those of us who are municipal directors have been listening to the frustration bordering on rage from our electoral director colleagues, and I think that this is pretty much the only way we're going to move this forward, and I'm very, very pleased that you came up with this option. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am sort of reluctant with this as well. It's just that for Area D, it's always been the frustration, right? So I was hoping to come with some solution in this. So it almost seems to me it would be status quo again, but we'll wait for the report.
Thank you. Director Acton, did you have your hand up? No? No. You twitched. You twitched, and you just bought something very expensive. Director Sebring.
Thank you. Earlier in the discussion, I made the point that we may not actually come to a concrete solution today, but that we have to move in some direction, that we have to show some leadership and a goal that says, you know, this is where we want to go and this is how we want to get there. And at that time I was talking about a 2 or a 4 or a 6 or a 10-year phase in of option F, which in a sense I would still prefer that we directly address the regional rec thing, which is what called us here together in the first place. But I really see this motion and what's being established here as a way to establish the process to exercise that leadership and move in the direction. I mean, it's maybe a bit slower than some of us had hoped, but some of us were, including me probably, were over-hoping in terms of what we might get out of this meeting. And I would say that to Director Yanni DiNardo as well. I mean, I sat through the Regional Rec Committee over the past 8 months or whatever it's been, and it was pretty clear there that this is not an easy nut to crack, and maybe we need to, you know, it's the old how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time. Well, we break it up into 4 little pieces, and now we work on those, and there are still some larger governance issues to do with, for example, the Sportsplex and the Aquatic Center that I'm not satisfied yet are addressed here, but that's maybe because I don't understand it. But as a process, I think this does move us in a direction, and that's what I was looking for out of today's meeting. It gives us a trajectory where we start heading down a road towards something, so I'm going to support it.
Thank you. Seeing no more hands up, can I call the question on the motion? All those in favor and opposed? Director Nicholson opposed. The motion carries. Do we need a formal motion about the
Yes, Mr.
committee?
Chair, I just have to look after the housekeeping here because you created a select committee and they have to be dissolved. So I've got a resolution here that the board acknowledges, and I also, just to pause for a second, I have to leave a trail in the select committee work that they ended. So that's why the motion is worded this way, that the board acknowledges the Regional Recreation Select Committee was unable to achieve consensus regarding funding regional recreation, and that the Regional Recreation Select Committee is dissolved.
And then just before I ask for a mover on that, Mr. Elzinga, to complete Phase 4, or as much of Phase 4 as you can do you need that committee?
It's an interesting question, Mr. Chair. I don't believe so. So I think I'm comfortable with the resolution as Mr. Berry has proposed. At this point, I do not necessarily see the need for the committee. Any direction can be provided by the board.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm looking for a mover. Moved by Director Kuhn, second by Director Jackson. Any question on this? Congratulations, you two. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Did you and I vote on something together once? I think we did.
Actually, just a
Director Walker?
point of process too, but I'll defer to Councillor Walker.
I'd like to move a motion of thanks and gratitude for the hard work that the committee has done and the efforts that they have gone through, and I think this board should acknowledge them, and maybe the chair should formalize it and write them a letter and thank them for their months of hard work.
And of course, that includes staff and the consultant who, I'm sure this wasn't their easiest exercise that they've ever proceeded through. And just adding to what Director Walker is saying, of course, no, okay, sorry, carry on. Okay. A letter, second by Director Yanni DiNardo.
I'd like to amend the motion. Instead of a letter, a check. Oh, sorry.
All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. And just, I think it's important for us to all recognize there was a lot of work, time, a lot of material produced. I think it's all critical to us coming to the decision we've come to today. So it is very much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Elzinga. Thanks, Mr. Mansuetti. And thank you, Mr. Carruthers, for helping come up with that way to move forward. Okay. Question period? Please come forward if you would like to ask a question on something on the agenda. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm exhausted. You guys. You may remember that in the comment period, I referred to the minutes of the previous meetings. I'm concerned that in those particular minutes and others that I have randomly looked at, there is no documented record of public input, comments, or questions on the minutes. As the public inputs and questions are of importance to the presenter and perhaps to area residents, could you comment as to why these inputs are not being documented in the minutes? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Berry?
Yes, Mr. Chair. To answer the question, it's because the CBRD practice, the minutes record the actions taken, not what was said. So for example, this discussion we've just been having since 9 a.m., the minutes are going to be about a page and a half. We do not record what was said. That's been a long-standing practice at the board and committees. However, if something, and more likely during question period, was raised that resulted in a motion, then that would be recorded because there's a motion made. So it's recording the actions taken.
Yeah, I understand that you can't document every word that was said, every grunt or groan or whatever, and that's understandable. Otherwise, yeah, we would have 30 pages of minutes.
I think it would be a lot more than 30.
Yeah, I'm sure it would. But the point I'm trying to make, and perhaps not very well, is that the comments and the questions which are brought forward by members of the public, and it is an intimidating thing to do for somebody who's not used to this, to actually stand up here and say, why is this happening? I do honestly think that that kind of thing should be documented. And if there's any way that you can include something that Mr. Wilson or Ms. Smith or whoever stood up and asked this question, then I think it would lead a long way towards the public being fully informed of what's actually happening here, not just having to go through trails and trails of video to see what happened.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I don't have a question. I would like to thank all of you for all the time that you have put into the regional recreation. It's a very important issue within the Cowichan Valley Regional District, and I admire all your time and effort. So it's not a question, it's a thank you.
Thank you. I was going to say you can't say that, but I was certainly going to wait till you were finished before I said that. Okay, I think we're at that key point where we can have a motion to adjourn, moved by Director Davis, second by Director Sebring. All in favor, opposed, carried. And I want to thank everyone very much because this was not an easy topic. Thank you.
Yeah.